Chapter 108. However, no matter how she tried to hide or how she begged for mercy, Mo Jingshan did not plan on letting her off easily tonight. His body pressed tightly against hers. Remembering that Jin Wan was wearing the gown Sheng Yihan had prepared for her today, he narrowed his eyes and abruptly flipped her around. Jin Wan's back was facing him. Feeling his kiss land on the sensitive part of her neck again, she couldn't help but twist her body. The man behind her let out a muffled groan and began to deliberately bite the back of her neck. Sometimes it was light, sometimes it was heavy, but it was as if he wanted to kill her. Furthermore, at the moment when Jin Wan was about to cry, he did not hesitate to barge in from behind. Jin Wan directly cried out. As she trembled uncontrollably, he leaned down by her ear. "You and the Sheng family's man don't ever see each other again, en? See, no, he's also a doctor, ah." Jin Wan was so agitated that she could not complete her sentence. What? When Mo Jingshan heard her first word, his actions became harsher. Jin Wan was bullied to the point where she could not think. She rushed to say, don't see, never again. I never planned on having anything to do with him." Mo Jingshan no longer planned on letting her off. No matter how she tried to explain or act coquettishly, he did not let up. The curtains in the room were half opened. Light shone in from the back. The man's upper body was bare, and his figure was smooth. This was the scene that Jin Wan saw when she opened her eyes. After a night of entanglement, she was tired and weak. She did not want to move at all. Even though the sun was already high in the sky, she did not bring her phone with her. Mo Jingshan's phone could no longer be used. It was rare for them to have such a quiet and undisturbed space. She did not want to ruin it. But last night, she felt that because of her jealousy and her minding, other than dissatisfaction, he seemed especially pleased with himself. At first she did not notice it. Later on, when she was forcefully pressed onto the bed and her head was about to hit the headboard, she finally heard a hint of delight in his words. In the past she always wanted a divorce. Later on she suddenly changed. Step by step they became successful. However, she remained calm and did not do anything extreme. Last night, he was extremely pleased, right? Because she was really jealous. Jin Wan used her eyes to describe the handsome face of the man beside her when he was asleep. When he was asleep, Mo Jingshan's handsome, quiet and aloof demeanor gave off a sense of approachability. Especially the coldness between his brows that could freeze one's heart and make one tremble at any time. Right now, it was completely gone. Like some kind of expensive and aloof feline, there was actually a little bit of softness in its sleep, making people want to get close to it. Jin Wan gently turned over in his arms and looked at him from the front. Seeing that his eyes were still closed, she blinked and raised her hand to trace the man's elegant and deep profile. Mo Jingshan's handsome face was against the light coming in from the window. In the darkness of the light, it appeared warm and dark. Jin Wan's fingers carefully and gently caressed his handsome brows, then his closed eyes and finally his high nose bridge. Her fingers gradually landed on his lips. On the man's pale lips, there was a small bite mark from last night. It was very small and could only be seen from such a close distance. This could not be blamed on her. Who asked him to be so fierce last night? Even if she cried and begged for mercy, it would not work. She was so angry that she could only bite him. Not only did she bite him, but Jin Wan's gaze also shifted to his back. Last night, she had even scratched his back harshly several times. "Have you seen enough?" All of a sudden, the man's low and mild voice rang by her fingers. Jin Wan jumped in fright and abruptly retracted her fingers. Mo Jingshan only spoke hoarsely. Without opening his eyes, he reached out and pulled the similarly naked Jin Wan into his embrace. His arms tightened around her waist. "What time is it now?" He hugged her. His voice was slightly sleepy and hoarse. It was indolent and overly sexy. Jin Wan glanced out the window. "I don't know. From the color of the sky, it should be past 6. His palm pressed against her back, gently patting it. "You only ate so little last night. Are you hungry?" Jin Wan wanted to say that she had expended so much energy last night. Right now, she was indeed awakened by hunger. However, being hugged by him like this, she would rather starve than get up. "No, I'm still sleepy." She buried her head in his embrace, speaking softly and coquettishly. The man's light chuckle came from above her head. It was very light. His hand caressed the back of her head. "Then continue sleeping." This time Jin Wan did not sleep well. Perhaps it was because Mo Jingshan did not continue sleeping. She was the only one on the bed. Less than an hour later she woke up again. The moment she sat up, she saw Mo Jingshan dressed in a dark brown bathrobe. He stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling bay window, slender and silent. She was about to lift the blankets and get off the bed when she recalled that her clothes from yesterday were all wet in the bathroom. They had also been pulled onto the floor by him. Right now they were most likely all bunched up and could not be worn again. Her gaze shifted and saw Mo Jingshan's clothes on the sofa not far from the bed. She quietly reached over, picked up a shirt and put it on. Then she tiptoed barefoot to the bathroom. Mo Jingshan sensed her movements. He turned around and saw that the little woman was wearing his shirt. Her entire leg was exposed. It was as white and smooth as porcelain. From time to time he would be able to see the scenery under the shirt with a single step. Jinwan did not notice that he had already discovered that she was awake. She softly entered the bathroom and quietly closed the door. She picked up the clothes on the floor and placed them on the glass countertop by the side. She then reached out to wash her face. The effects of last night's alcohol had completely dissipated. Jinwan thought about what happened at the banquet last night as she picked up the facial cleanser provided by the hotel and rubbed it in her hands. The bathroom door was made of a translucent frosted material. A black shadow approached from the door. Jinwan's movements faltered. She raised her head to see that the door had opened. Mo Jingshan's dark eyes were slightly lowered as he looked at her. His expression was calm and unhurried, but he blocked the bathroom door completely. The bathroom in this hotel was not as big as the one at home. The door also appeared much smaller compared to his height. Although the door was clearly blocked, Jinwan strangely felt that between his brows, there was a lingering emotion from last night's events. Especially his usually cool and indifferent gaze. At this moment, it was as though there was a fire that was about to burn the shirt on her body. Jinwan paused and subconsciously tightened her legs. "You want to use the bathroom? I'll go out after washing my face." As she spoke, she raised the foam in her hands. "It'll be done in a moment." Mo Jingshan watched her, slowly and hoarsely making an end sound. He took 2 steps in. Chapter 109. Mo Jingshan dragged her over, pressing her against the glass countertop. He lowered his head to kiss her, gently nibbling and sucking on her lips. His sudden kiss caused Jinwan's legs to soften. She almost lost her balance. Her entire body was enveloped by his scent. The man's scent was cold and persistent, possessing his unique warmth. She was wearing his shirt, which barely covered her thighs. He only had to lift his eyes slightly to see her tightly pressed legs through the full-length mirror in the bathroom behind her. Mo Jingshan held her even tighter, pressing her against his body as he kissed her even more deeply. The bathroom was small and the temperature climbed. Steam rose and the sound of water splashing could be heard from the tap. He pressed the back of her head with one hand and held onto her slender waist with the other, bringing her forward. Jinwan was unable to defend herself and could only lean heavily against his embrace. Jinwan's hands were still wet with the foam from the facial cleanser. She did not dare to push him away. Her body did not have any support, and the sound of water was by her ears, causing her mind to be in chaos. She suddenly wanted to reach over to turn off the tap. However, the moment she moved, Mo Jingshan mercilessly bit down on the tip of her tongue. Jinwan instinctively struggled slightly. She was kissed and dodged to the side, softly crying out. He chuckled mischievously, speaking softly by her ears. "Why are you hiding? Dressed like this, what do you want to do?" Jinwan softly panted as she dodged. "Last night when I helped you shower, my clothes were all wet. If I don't wear yours, don't tell me I can." Mo Jingshan smiled. His eyes were dark and deep, extremely alluring. "There's no one else here and the air conditioner is warm enough. You can choose not to wear it." Jinwan directly glared at him. "I'm not an exhibitionist. Besides, I just wanted to wash my face. I didn't want to do anything." He purposely moved his hand under her shirt. Jinwan's entire body trembled from the invasion of his fingers. She only heard the man's teasing voice by her ears. "You didn't want to do anything? Then what's going on here?" Jinwan's entire body suddenly stiffened. Her face was flushed red. She lowered her head and buried it in his neck. She softly whimpered, her body trembling slightly. Mo Jingshan pushed her up again and again. When she could no longer hold on, he pressed her down harshly. After tossing and turning in the bathroom for a while, he chuckled hoarsely. "Shall we go out? Jinwan? Put me down first." Mo Jingshan smiled and didn't let go of her. He carried her out. She buried her head in his neck, and her toes curled up because of the place where they were connected. As soon as he put her on the bed, she was pinned under his body. Looking at her long hair spread out, he pulled a strand of it to his lips and kissed it. Jinwan panted softly and could not help but laugh. She raised her hand to pull her hair back, grumbling, "It's so early in the morning and you're already like this. Do you really have to take half my life?" He casually pinched her hair and slid it down her collarbone. When Jinwan couldn't stand the teasing and trembled, he snorted at her reaction and chuckled softly against her ear. "I've been so busy these days that I can only go home after midnight. My woman sleeps by my side and I can only hug her but can't eat her. Can't you let me get back some interest?" "You can wake me up," he smiled. "I can't bear to." "Then you can bear to do it now?" "I woke up hungry in the morning. You're still squeezing me like this." Mo Jingshan made an N sound. "Very tired? Then I'll slow down." "Jinwan, slow down?" He was clearly using a different method to slowly and patiently torment her. Jinwan was tormented by his suddenly slowing movements. Her entire body felt numb and she suddenly raised her body cooperatively. Mo Jingshan raised his brows, abruptly retreating along with her movements. The more she took the initiative to approach, the more he retreated. After going back and forth several times, Jinwan was angered by him. She reached out to push him hard. "Bastard. You're doing this on purpose." Seeing that her charming expression was mixed with anger, Mo Jingshan's lips curved. Abruptly, he sent himself in deeply and heavily. Jinwan had wanted to push him away, but in the blink of an eye, this action caused her to moan. She could no longer say a word as she glared at him. After a long while, she finally managed to catch her breath. She weakly and hoarsely complained, "I've really been tricked by your appearance. You're really a beast." Mo Jingshan chuckled softly. "You're dressed like this in front of me. If I'm not moved, then I'm worse than a beast." Jinwan? She was actually speechless. 2 hours later, Jinwan was finally able to climb up from the bed to eat. Mo Jingshan was still considerate enough to push the dining cart the hotel staff had brought into her bedside, saving her from the pain of getting off the bed. After all, right now her legs were really weak. "In the future, no matter what happens, remember to ask me first. Don't let your imagination run wild and be unhappy, remember?" Mo Jingshan handed the cutlery to her. His gaze was stern as though the ruffian from this morning was not him at all. Jinwan bit on the fragrant and delicious enoki mushroom, raising her eyes to say, "Yesterday I didn't understand the situation clearly. It's my fault, but you should at least remind me. Otherwise, if it was any other woman, they would not be able to accept it." Mo Jingshan raised his brows. "You still have the energy to discuss right and wrong with me?" "Jinwan, I don't." He snorted but did not tease her further. He allowed her to eat in peace. Only when Jinwan was full did Mo Jingshan's unhurried and calm voice ring out. "Do you remember what you promised me last night?" "And? What did I promise?" Jinwan could not remember what she had promised. She raised her eyes in surprise. Mo Jingshan's gaze darkened. His gaze was cold. "You promised not to see Xingyi Han again. Are you selectively amnesiac?" She was quiet for a moment before directly asking, "Do you know a lot about me? For example, before we got married or even a few years earlier?" Mo Jingshan did not answer. His gaze toward her was unfathomable and unfathomable. After a moment, he raised his hand to pinch her cheek. "You have to keep your promises, En?" "I can do that, but you haven't answered me. Do you really know a lot about my past?" "But in my impression before we got married, I didn't have much interaction with the Mo family or you. Previously, when Ji Minggran mentioned Xingyi Han, you automatically ignored it. Later on you didn't even mention it. But from last night until now, you clearly don't know anything about my past." Mo Jingshan's hand paused on her lips. His warm fingers caressed her lips as he unhurriedly said, "That's not important. You just have to remember you're Mrs. Mo." Jinwan's heart shrank from the warmth on her lips. "What kind of answer is that?" Chapter 110. Jinwan was slightly stunned. In the next second he had already kissed her. "Why are you kissing whenever you want to? Just kissing." Mo Jingshan's words carried a hint of teasing. Was he going to do it again? Could it be that feeding her earlier was just to save up energy? After a kiss he finally released her. He placed his palm behind her head, pressing against her forehead as he watched her. "Mrs. Mo once said, 'No one can have any ideas about your man.'" He lowered his head to admire the moisture in her eyes, watching with satisfaction as she was kissed into a daze. "On the other hand, if anyone dares to have any ideas about Mrs. Mo, I definitely won't be polite." Mo Jingshan actually had such a domineering side, yet it did not appear to be intentional. Furthermore, this man's domineering side did not make her unhappy. Instead, it made her instinctively want to express her stance. In the past, her relationship with Xing Yihan had always been a one-sided problem. It had nothing to do with her. Jinwan stared at him and suddenly took the initiative to hug his shoulders. She raised her head and kissed him harshly on the lips. Under the man's dark and turbulent gaze, she sincerely said, "All right." This one word was so sincere that it was as though she wanted to hand over the little world hidden in her heart to his hands. Mo Jingshan lowered his eyes, pressing her down on the bed. Jinwan fell back, looking at the man on top of her. In front of others, this clear and gentle man was the unapproachable CEO Mo. But at this moment he was seductive like a fiery and bewitching demon. There was no one else like him. On the other side, even after the banquet ended, and Xu Yan did not see Mo Jingshan return. Everyone in Haiqing knew that Mo Jingshan was a cold and rational person. Yet, this man who was never affected by his emotions actually made an exception for Jinwan. Early in the morning, and Xu Yan met Mo Xiaoza at the staircase of Wangting Hotel. Uncle Mo, and Xu Yan politely nodded at him. Mo Xiaoza glanced at her, asking sternly, "Your complexion is so bad. You didn't sleep last night?" And Xu Yan smiled slightly. "I slept. Perhaps I slept too late. My complexion doesn't look good." "Everything you've seen and heard in the country these days, is it the same as last night?" Jingshan is serious about that, Jinwan? Mo Xiaoza's expression was dark. And Xu Yan hesitated for a moment and did not speak. Instead, she slowly nodded her head. Mo Xiaoza first raised his eyebrows in extreme dissatisfaction, then narrowed his eyes coldly. After a moment, Mo Xiaoza said slowly, "Since that's the case, do you still want Mrs. Mo's identity?" And Xu Yan was silent for a long time. She took 2 deep breaths, her gaze filled with stubbornness. "Uncle Mo, what you should be asking me is, do I still want this man Mo Jingshan?" Without waiting for Mo Xiaoza to speak, her voice was soft but firm. "My answer is, I want it." Mo Xiaoza looked at her sternly for a long time before finally waving his hand at her. "All right, I understand. Go back and rest." And Xu Yan nodded at him respectfully. "Thank you, Uncle Mo." As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around. When Shinmu brought her phone over, Jinwan was drying her hair in the bathroom. The sound of the wind was too loud. She only knew that Shinmu had brought her bag and Mo Jingshan's things over. When she walked out after drying her hair, Shinmu was respectfully and softly speaking to Mo Jingshan outside the door. "All right, CEO Mo, I understand." Mo Jingshan indicated that he could leave. Shinmu nodded and turned to smile politely at Jinwan before turning to leave. "Neither of us brought our phones. How did Shinmu know we were here?" Jinwan glanced at the back view of him walking toward the elevator. She casually asked as he closed the door. Mo Jingshan calmly glanced at her, using his chin to point at the phone in the room. She took her bag and searched for the clothes she wore in the car yesterday, but only the clothes inside. Her coat was still left in Xing Yihan's car. Jinwan finally realized what was going on. She took her bag and searched for the clothes she wore in the car yesterday. She hesitated for a moment and did not dare to mention Xing Yihan's name. After changing her clothes, she found that her phone had been out of battery since last night. She took out the charger from her bag and placed the phone on the bedside table. However, the moment she charged the phone and turned it on, she heard the sound of several text messages. The first one that popped up on the screen was from an unfamiliar number. "Rest well." It was a very ordinary word, but it was so concise that there was not even a punctuation mark. Jinwan stared at the 4 words, her fingers pausing on the screen. After a long moment of confusion, she finally guessed who it was. She opened the phone's photo album and found the record of Xia Tian's diagnosis. There was a page with Xia Tian's attending doctor's phone number. It was indeed Xing Yihan. All these years, she and Xing Yihan had tacitly ignored each other. Even when they passed each other in the hospital, it was as though they were strangers. He was his orthopedic doctor and she was her Mrs. Mo. They had long had nothing to do with each other, but now, he suddenly appeared in her sight with ulterior motives. What was the reason? Was it because he was about to officially return to the Xing family? Was it because one of the 4 large families in Haiqing would belong to him? Was he really, as she had once seen him, hiding a monstrous ambition under his handsome appearance? Mo Jingshan had just made a call to the company. When he turned his gaze back from the window, he saw her thoughtful expression and asked, "What's wrong?" Jinwan raised her head, her gaze pausing on the man's overly gentle and perfect face. Her expression remained calm, but her fingers quickly moved to delete the message that should not have appeared. "Nothing." Mo Jingshan looked at the woman by the bed, narrowing his eyes. The little girl's fingers quickly tapped on the screen of her phone. He only glanced at her indifferently before he strode over and took her phone from her. Jean Wan wanted to reach out to snatch it back but retracted her hand due to the man's indifferent expression. That message had already been deleted. Mo Jingshan was currently looking at the top unread message. It was from Xia Tian. 3 consecutive messages. Mine Wan. My little heart has been shocked. I've already been unable to sleep for several days. That Dr. Sheng is simply too handsome. After interacting with him for so many days in the hospital, I actually didn't realize how good his looks are. Are you really familiar with Dr. Sheng? Does he have unidirectional autism? Otherwise, why is he usually so cold? He doesn't even say a word of superfluous nonsense. With just a glance he can freeze a person half to death. On account of that face of his, I'll forgive this iceberg. I still can't sleep. Also, this Dr. Sheng's facial features are extremely well proportioned. The bridge of his nose is very straight. Isn't it said that a man's nose is directly proportional to his lower body? This iceberg may appear refined in his white coat, but it completely cannot conceal his powerful nature. Sob, my heart is moved, I really want to sleep with him. Wan, since you've known him before, have you never had feelings for Dr. Sheng before? Seeing Mo Jingshan's unperturbed expression, the surrounding temperature clearly dropped several degrees. Jean Wan held her forehead. Chapter 111. Just from these few messages she felt that her life was about to end soon. Best friends always spoke without restraint. In their messages they dared to say all sorts of dirty jokes. This was practically stabbing a knife into Mo Jingshan's eyes. Then she saw Mo Jingshan's gaze. It was as though there were knives shooting toward her. His gaze was cold and filled with coldness. Cold rain, autumn frost, snow on the summit of a mountain, and many other words were unable to describe his piercingly cold expression. Cough. Jean Wan raised her hand guiltily to push the loose strands of hair behind her ear, calmly explaining, This is how we women chat in private. We don't care if it's meat or vegetables. Mo Jingshan glanced at her heavily. He still did not return the phone to her. His sharp gaze scraped her from top to bottom. The way you talk without restraint is to study a man's nose? Jean Wan, although she was not thinking of such a thing, her gaze unconsciously drifted toward Mo Jingshan's nose. She vaguely remembered that when they first got married, because she always resisted this marriage, Xia Tian had earnestly and patiently nagged about how this man Mo Jingshan was and whatnot. She also seemed to have said that Mo Jingshan's nose was tall and straight. Although he looked like an ascetic male god, his size was definitely not small. In any case, she had evaluated Mo Jingshan from all aspects and did not forget to be infatuated with him for several days. She said that it was a waste for Jean Wan to not sleep with a man like this. Her gaze suddenly met Mo Jingshan's. Jean Wan abruptly returned to herself and immediately reached out to snatch the phone back. The private conversations between women have always been nondescript. We talk about whatever comes to our minds. Only you men are allowed to admire a woman's black stockings, beautiful legs and high heels in the summer, but we women are not allowed to occasionally talk about such topics? Jean Wan tried to defend herself as she tried to snatch the phone back. Mo Jingshan coldly glanced at her. He raised his hand slightly and brushed the phone away from her hand, not letting her have her way. When have you ever seen me pay attention to a woman's body below her shoulders? His tone was unkind. Jean Wan rolled her eyes. Every day you toss and turn me. Don't talk about below the shoulders, even below the waist has been seen by you, all right? Not to mention looking around, he had kissed her from top to bottom, inside and out. Mo Jingshan chuckled coldly at her unreasonableness. Apart from you. I don't care. In any case, return my phone to me first. Jean Wan could not win against him. She jumped onto the bed barefooted and pounced over to snatch it back. Seeing her pounce on him, Mo Jingshan didn't dodge or raise his hand. When she finally touched the phone, he pressed his arm against her waist and pressed her whole body into his arms. Jean Wan was caught off guard and fell forward. She stumbled so hard that half of her body fell toward him, and her entire face was pressed against the man's chin. She was about to step back with the phone in her hand when the strong arm behind her waist tightened. The man's low voice rang by her ear. For the sake of the private conversation between you women, Mrs. Mo is even willing to throw herself into your arms. You were clearly the one who suddenly pressed down on my waist. Jean Wan raised her head to explain. The moment she raised her head, her lips brushed past his. She had yet to react when the man held the back of her head and kissed her. She could not stand steadily on the bed. Half of her body was pressed against his. She twisted her waist and held the phone tightly in her hand. This position, she could not tell if it was ambiguous or awkward. In any case, this kiss was not ambiguous at all. Instead, it was more like a punishment. It was so heavy that it robbed her of all her breath. Only when Jin Wan's tongue was numb from the kiss did the man release her. His gaze no longer had any warmth as it landed on her phone. Before the sky turns dark, arrange for her to be transferred to another orthopedic hospital. This was the undeniable sentence Mo Jingshin said by Jin Wan's lips just as she was about to suffocate from the kiss. Transfer? She looked at him. 2 days ago, I did have this intention, but Xia Tian's legs can't move. If she gets hurt during the transfer, you're worried about the person I sent? Mo Jingshin lowered his head, indifferently glancing at her. His goal was to keep her away from Xing Yihan, while her goal was to keep Xia Tian away from that scumbag. Regardless of the reason, it was a good thing for Xia Tian to leave her current hospital. It could be considered as settling the matter once and for all. All right then. Which hospital should she be transferred to? I'll arrange it. Jin Wan responded and glanced at him from time to time. He clearly minded those few messages earlier. He minded it a lot. If he had seen Xing Yihan's message, it was likely that it would not be as simple as transferring Xia Tian's hospital. Jin Wan was thankful that her hands were fast enough to delete that message. At the same time, she was cursing that bastard Xia Tian in her heart. She really caused so much trouble. It was fine if she liked to chat dirty jokes with her. She could talk about which muscular male celebrity on the television or which male model with hormones bursting out of control. But she actually talked about Xing Yihan. She had seen people dig holes for their bosom friends, but she had never seen someone dig holes like this. Xia Tian, that idiot. Jin Wan lowered her head. She replied to Xia Tian's message while informing her of the transfer and celebrating that she could finally break free from the iceberg. She then ignored Xia Tian's cries of pain and raised her eyes to look at Mo Jingshin. That's right. She took the initiative to change the topic. At the hospital, there's a bank owner chasing after Xia Tian. But he's a scumbag from head to toe. Can you do me a favor and prevent that man from getting close to Xia Tian again? It's best if he's thrown to Africa and never to return. Mo Jingshin glanced at the woman who looked like she wanted to forget about the earlier incident. He calmly asked, "What bank?" "I think it's a private bank in Haicheng. It has financial dealings with banks in Hong Kong and Taiwan." Mo Jingshin's tone was heavy. "It's just a small to medium-sized financial company. If they want to send someone to Africa legally, they can just buy it." Jin Wan pursed her lips. "Buy it?" The Mo Corporation's business range is very wide. Many of the private banks and financial companies in Haicheng have dealings with the Mo Corporation. It's just a small bank. Do you still want to waste your time fighting with him? That was right. Fighting with that kind of scumbag was indeed a waste of time. Buying their bank shares was not only the most direct method, but it was also killing two birds with one stone. After all, the financial industry was also becoming more and more profitable. Obtaining a relationship with a bank was also a kind of gain. Buying it would not be a loss. Jin Wan suddenly smiled. She held onto his arm and took the initiative to act spoiled. "Thank you, hubby. Hubby is the best. Hubby is the best." Chapter 112. Jin Wan reached out to tug on his sleeves. As she tugged, she blinked at him with incomparable sincerity. "I've really never had any feelings for Xing Yihan. You should know that before I married into the Mo family, I've never had any official boyfriends, nor do I have any so-called past. I'm practically the model of a clean body and mind." Hearing the word model, Mo Jingshin mildly glanced at her. It was clear that he had gained a rare bit of patience from her sincere explanation. Jin Wan took the opportunity to hug his arm. "Before you, I've never loved any man." A trace of a smile appeared on Mo Jingshin's face. He reached out to smooth her hair, asking meaningfully, "Is Mrs. Mo confessing to me? You love me?" Jin Wan's heart stirred for a moment. Between her and Mo Jingshin, there had been all sorts of sweetness and warmth, but the word love had never been mentioned. She had yet to reply when she saw the man's lips curve slightly deeper. It seemed like his mood had suddenly improved. His mood was indeed not bad. Jin Wan's heart was currently in complete turmoil. The question that she had never dared to think about had suddenly leaped out in front of her unintentionally. By the time Jin Wan returned to herself, Mo Jingshin's hand had already tangled in her hair. He was watching her with a slight smile. "Aren't you going to continue charging your phone?" Jin Wan finally recalled that her phone had only been charged for less than 2 minutes before being unplugged. She rushed to continue charging. When she turned back, she saw that Mo Jingshin had picked up the remote control by the bedside and raised the temperature of the air conditioning by 2 degrees. The man's back view was tall and steady. No matter what time it was, he would always be unhurried and calm. Jinwan suddenly chuckled lightly. Mo Jingshin turned to glance at her. What are you laughing at? Nothing much. It's just that I suddenly realized that the great CEO Mo is like a professional nanny in front of me. No matter if it's hot or cold, he can take care of me meticulously. I should actually be moved to tears. I shouldn't be laughing at all. I admit my mistake. As she spoke, she could not help but laugh out loud. Her eyes curved into crescents as she laughed. Mo Jingshin casually tossed the remote control onto the bed, calmly saying, "It won't be too late to laugh when you learn how to take care of yourself." Jinwan slept again in the afternoon. After all, she had used up all her energy last night and this morning. He only woke up when the sky turned dark. When he woke up, he saw Mo Jingshin sitting on the sofa. In his hands were the company documents that Shinmu had sent over in the afternoon, as well as some files that he needed to look through personally. The sofa in this hotel room was very soft. Mo Jingshin's sitting posture was elegant and proper. This man's beauty seemed to be innate. Even if he was just sitting there quietly looking at the company documents, he would still attract everyone's attention. Jinwan got off the bed. She had just walked over when Mo Jingshin raised his head to look at her. His clear and heavy expression met her sleepy appearance. "You're not going to sleep?" he asked. "It's getting dark. Sleep after 10 o'clock. Otherwise your schedule will be messed up." Jinwan saw the logo of Shine Group printed on the document in his hand. Knowing that it was a cooperation project with Shine Group, she didn't want to disturb him. Jinwan turned to pour him a glass of water. "Come here," Mo Jingshin called. Hearing this, Jinwan approached the sofa. Mo Jingshin patted the seat beside him, indicating for her to sit down. Jinwan glanced at the water dispenser and gave up on the idea of pouring him a glass of water. She obediently sat down. The man's arms circled around her waist, naturally and intimately holding her in his embrace. His gaze remained focused on the documents in his hands. "Since Shine's project hasn't ended, why didn't you return to the company today? You've wasted the entire day in the hotel with me." "I'm already feeling bad," Jinwan took the opportunity to ask as he placed the documents in his hands down. Mo Jingshin mildly curved his lips. He raised his hand to press against his brows. After resting for a few seconds, he picked up the documents again and continued reading. At the same time, his hand around her waist moved up, running through her soft hair. His gaze was on the documents, but his voice was directed at her. "There are just some follow-up matters that require my signature. I've worked overtime for almost a week, so I'll spend more time with you these 2 days." As he spoke, he lowered his head to look at her. "Not just today. My time tomorrow belongs to you as well." From last night until today, the two of them had stayed in this hotel room. Their food and necessities had all been sent up by the hotel staff. Although it was rare for the two of them to have such a pure, undisturbed world, why did Jinwan feel that Mo Jingshin was implying that tomorrow, the two of them might have to spend the entire day in bed? When the hotel's dinner arrived, Jinwan nibbled on the pork ribs while thinking about how she could enjoy such a warm and peaceful vacation time with Mo Jingshin while perfectly avoiding contact with the bed. "Why isn't there a single vegetable dish in the hotel's meal tonight?" Jinwan asked as she ate. "We've stayed in the room for an entire day and even had a stomach full of meat at night. Why don't we find a place to pick some vegetables and fruits to cook for ourselves tomorrow? Is there any specialized organic vegetable garden in Haicheng?" Mo Jingshin glanced at her as though he could instantly see through her thoughts. After 2 seconds he said, "There is. I'll bring you there tomorrow." Jinwan placed another piece of pork ribs into her mouth, her heart filled with joy. She finally found a perfect excuse to avoid the bed. The next day, Jinwan had just pushed open Mo Jingshin's car door and stepped out when she saw a cluster of villas located in the wealthy area of Haicheng. Although it was a cluster of villas, it was a priceless area in Haicheng. There were not many people living here because not everyone could live here. How could there be a vegetable garden in a place like this? "Did you bring me here to pick the grass?" Jinwan suspected that she had been tricked by him and turned back to ask. Mo Jingshin parked the car and walked over. "Go to Qin Siding's place. You can pick whatever you want." "Ah? This is where Dr. Qin lives?" Jinwan was astonished. "He lives here alone. The backyard of the villa is spacious. In recent years, the Qin family's elder likes to grow his own vegetables and fruits. There isn't enough space at home, so he took over Qin Siding's backyard." Jinwan's gaze shifted toward the villa. "So, behind such a beautiful high-class villa in Dr. Qin's home, there's actually a vegetable garden?" This strange scene, As they spoke, a low-profile gray sports car drove in from the empty road. Originally it was about to drive past them when it suddenly braked. The car window rolled down, revealing Qin Siding's slightly surprised handsome face. "What's the situation? Why have you come to my place?" Jin Wan felt as though she was about to steal vegetables but was discovered by the owner. She raised her hand and awkwardly waved at him. "Hi, Dr. Qin." Qin Siding's gaze shifted down, noticing the basket in Jin Wan's hands. He did not know where she had gotten it from. Chapter 113. The security of this villa area was very strict. Thankfully, Qin Siding returned in time, saving Jin Wan a lot of unnecessary trouble. She followed him in. After receiving permission, Jin Wan carried the basket all the way to the back of the villa. Qin Siding glanced at the floor-to-ceiling window behind him. He watched the woman in the backyard with a lukewarm smile on his lips as he leaned against the wine cabinet by the side. He took out a bottle of aged red wine and poured it into a goblet. He handed a glass to Mo Jingshan, swirling the wine in the glass as he casually said, "You really have endless ways of coaxing a woman. You even selflessly contribute to me." Mo Jingshan's lips curved imperceptibly. He took a sip of the wine and placed the glass down. "When did your taste become so bad?" he mildly mocked. Qin Siding coldly snorted. "I have at least 5 to 6 operations in the hospital every day. I'm so busy that I don't even have time to go home. The wine cabinet is filled with gifts from others. There are both good and bad ones. It's already not bad to have a few drinkable bottles. You're still picky?" Mo Jingshan coldly said, "I'll ask Shenmu to send 2 bottles over another day." Qin Siding raised his brows, placing down the wine glass. He could not hold back his laughter as he said, "It turns out this transaction is still worth it. Your wine is all 80 years old high-quality wine. A basket of vegetables and fruits can be exchanged for 2 bottles of good wine. In the future, can I quit my job and focus on nurturing this vegetable field? It's even more profitable than being a doctor." Although Mo Jingshan was slightly disgusted, he still picked up the glass of wine and took a sip. A moment later, he indifferently said, "Ever since that woman kicked you away and went overseas, your quality of life and taste have been plummeting. I really can't stand it anymore." Qin Siding poured another glass of wine, but his smile did not reach his eyes. He turned to glance at Jin Wan, who was picking vegetables excitedly behind him. He narrowed his eyes to say, "Brothers are like limbs, women are like clothes. This old man has gotten used to being naked these years." Mo Jingshan's cold brows moved. He mockingly glanced at him. "Who was the one who almost broke his own limbs for a woman? You speak as though you've seen through the mortal world. Do you really think you're a vegetarian monk?" Qin Siding frowned without batting an eyelid. He did not speak at first, but a moment later he poured a glass of wine and drank it in one gulp. Putting down the wine glass heavily, Qin Siding sneered coldly. "So what if you have a woman?" Impressive." Qin Siding choked and stared at him with a smile. He then raised his hand and pressed between his brows. "I'm going to the back to see your woman." "Don't King disgust me here." Jin Wan was currently picking vegetables from the vegetable field in the backyard. She did not expect Dr. Qin's backyard to be so large. There were all kinds of vegetables and fruits. Although it was autumn, more than half of the backyard was covered with a greenhouse that could gather sunlight and heat. It could be seen that the Qin family's elder was indeed fond of these things. He even arranged such professional autumn and winter planting facilities so appropriately. Although the style of this vegetable garden and orchard was really out of place in this high-class villa area, standing in this lush green field was really relaxing and refreshing. Most importantly, Dr. Qin's home was very clean. The fruits and vegetables in the backyard were also grown especially well. There was no need to worry about pesticides or other chemicals like the orchards outside. Jin Wan plucked a bright red tomato and casually plucked the cabbage by the side. It was fresh and juicy. Even though it had not been washed or cooked, it was already stimulating one's appetite. Abruptly, she heard footsteps from nearby. She turned to see Qin Siding leisurely approaching. He glanced at the things in her basket, and a trace of a smile flashed past his eyes. "Mrs. Mo is so carefree. I almost thought you came here for a vacation." Qin Siding walked over, casually picking up a cabbage from the basket. "And speaking of which, it seems like our Qin family can also expand into the agricultural vegetable industry in the future. For these kinds of vegetables, 100 yuan per piece is not too much. Thankfully, you're not interested in the Qin family's company. Otherwise, with your scamming behavior, the Qin family would be ruined in a few years." Jean Wan half-jokingly plucked another tomato. She casually wiped it in her hands and took a bite. Qin Siding glanced at her. You're eating it without washing it? There are no pesticides on it. It's not like there's anything wrong with eating it. Jean Wan's mood was especially good due to the sweet and sour taste in her mouth. She completely ignored Qin Siding's disgusted expression and used her other hand to pluck another tomato for him. Seeing that he did not take it, she raised her eyebrows and tossed it into the basket. I know you doctors are all misophobic, but don't be so spoiled, all right? You don't even want to eat something so natural. Don't tell me you only drink disinfectant every day? Qin Siding stood casually with his arms crossed. He casually and indifferently glanced at her. The spoiled G family's young miss actually dares to say someone else is spoiled? Ah, are you slapping your own past face? Have you forgotten what kind of temper you had in the past? People change, Yi Zichen said. Jean Wan did not look at him. She lowered her head to inspect the vegetables in the basket. Her tone was warm and calm. Regardless of whether it was in the past or now, I'm still me. It's normal for my personality and habits to change a little. Qin Siding suddenly laughed mockingly, coldly and indifferently saying, Indeed, women are all fickle. Jean Wan's hand that was fiddling with the vegetables in the basket suddenly paused. She vaguely heard some deeper meaning in his tone and instinctively felt that Qin Siding had a story. She raised her head and glanced at him. Qin Siding did not look at her again. When he turned around, he coldly threw down a sentence. Be careful. Don't step on the radishes and potatoes on the ground. If you damage them, my family's elder will directly look for your family's Mo Jingshan to settle the score. Jean Wan paused. She lowered her head to look at the things planted in the soil by her feet. Earlier on, she did not pay attention to this side. Thankfully, she did not step on them. The fruits are all at the back. If it's too high, take a ladder and pick them yourself. Last night, you could even jump out of the window. Climbing a tree shouldn't be difficult for you. While speaking, Qin Siding glanced at her with a hint of a smile. When Jean Wan directly rolled her eyes at him, he used his chin to point not far away. The ladder is over there. It's very safe. You won't fall. Thanks. Jean Wan took another bite of the tomato in her hand and turned to head to the orchard behind. It was as though they had a great harvest. Jean Wan happily held the basket full of vegetables as she walked back from the back. Dr. Qin, is the kitchen in your house usable? Jean Wan asked excitedly. Qin Siding narrowed his eyes. So you're not only here to pick vegetables, but you're really treating my place as a holiday villa. You even want to start a fire and cook? Not only do we want to start a fire, we're also planning to stay here tonight. Do you have any objections? Qin Siding leaned against the door. It's been 2 months and I finally have a rare day off. Just for this one day, I have to watch the two of you show off your affection in front of me. It hurts my eyes. Chapter 114. You don't want to see? Mo Jingshan casually tossed a high-class residential area access card onto the coffee table in front of Qin Siding. AO Lan International belongs to you tonight. Limited to guest rooms. The password is Jean Wan's birthday. Qin Siding lightly snorted. How would I know when your woman's birthday is? Jean Wan had already entered the kitchen with the basket in her hands. However, she could still hear Qin Siding's voice from outside. Furthermore, I'm not stupid. Why would I run to your place to eat takeout when the food is delivered to my mouth? As he spoke, Qin Siding casually tossed his coat aside and elegantly sat down on the sofa. It was as though he was prepared to wait for Jean Wan to prepare a sumptuous meal for them. Jean Wan walked out and saw Qin Siding's expression as though he was waiting to enjoy himself today. She could not help but laugh. She found an apron and wrapped it around her neck before returning to the kitchen. Speaking of which, does Jean Wan know how to cook? Qin Siding finally remembered the most serious problem. His brows rose. Mo Jingshan did not reply. His suit had long been placed aside. He casually unbuttoned his sleeves and rolled up his sleeves. He indifferently and coldly said, To be able to taste my woman's cooking, you should say that you're blessed for 3 lifetimes. Qin Siding snorted, clearly not believing him. Are you serious? Will I get food poisoning today? Mo Jingshan, you can choose to starve or not eat. By the time he finished speaking, Mo Jingshan had already entered the kitchen. Seeing that Jean Wan was washing vegetables, he approached. What else do you need to wash? I'll help you. Jean Wan did not raise her head, continuing to wash the vegetables seriously. There's no need. I can do it myself. Dr. Qin's house usually has helpers coming over to clean or cook. There's nothing lacking in this kitchen. It's easy to find. I can handle it myself. As she spoke, she turned to pick up the peeler to peel the potatoes. Her back was facing Mo Jingshan. The man approached from behind, helping her tie the 2 straps on the back of her apron. Did the straps come loose? Earlier on, my hands were wet, so I casually tied it. I didn't pay much attention. Jinwan turned back to glance behind her before raising her eyes to smile at Mo Jingshan. The little woman smiled gently, turning back to continue washing the vegetables. Her serious appearance caused Mo Jingshan to be unable to shift his gaze away. The kitchen seemed to be in harmony. Even now, Qin Siding deeply suspected that Jinwan, who had always been a pampered young lady, would actually cook. From the sound of it, there was no messiness in the kitchen or the sound of pots and pans falling to the ground. It was steady, orderly, harmonious, and calm. The sound of vegetables being washed and cut was more like the most soothing rhythm in the world. Jinwan really knew how to cook. This realization caused Qin Siding to start doubting his life. I ate meat last night and now it's all vegetarian again. Jinwan suddenly poked her head out from the kitchen door, looking at Qin Siding who was sitting on the sofa and doubting his life. Dr. Qin, you should be familiar with this area, right? Can you go to the supermarket and help me buy some fish and some meat suitable for stir-frying? Qin Siding raised his brows and glanced at her in surprise. You want me to buy it? Don't tell me you want me to go? Jinwan raised her still wet hands. I'm still washing and cutting the vegetables. Going back and forth is too much of a waste of time. Where's your man? Qin Siding casually placed a hand on the back of the sofa. Jingshan is helping me. He's not very familiar with this area. As Jinwan spoke, she chuckled at him. Dr. Qin, if you want to eat early, I'll have to trouble you to run an errand. Otherwise, all of us will have to starve. Troublesome. Qin Siding complained impatiently, but he still got up. He picked up his coat and placed it on his arm. Then he picked up the electronic car key and strode out the door. Jinwan turned back to the cupboard, only to see that in just a short while, Mo Jingshan had already helped her separate the vegetables she had washed and put them away. Then she saw the man in a shirt and trousers mixing the seasonings of each dish in proportion to each bowl. The man was tall and straight to begin with. Now that he was standing here doing all this, the difference from a high-ranking elite to a housekeeper actually gave rise to a kind of warmth that could warm people to death. Most of the things she needed to do had already been done by him. Thus, Mo Jingshan was not helping her at all. Instead, it was clearly she who was helping him. Tiske, in that case, what Mo Jingshan had said to Qin Siding earlier should be, to be able to taste Mo Jingshan's cooking, it was definitely Qin Siding's fortune of 3 lifetimes. Qin Siding followed Jinwan's request and bought raw fish, meat and other fresh ingredients. He threw the shopping bag into the kitchen and did not pay them any more attention. He returned to the bathroom to wash his hands twice. Jinwan saw it and leaned against Mo Jingshan's side to mutter, I heard that doctors have the habit of washing their hands dozens of times a day. It seems like this is true. Mo Jingshan smiled and did not say anything. The man's arms that were exposed from his sleeves were firm and strong. He placed the pot on the stove, his movements smooth and handsome. Jinwan cut the newly bought meat while softly asking, Is it really because Dr. Qin has loved to learn medicine since he was young that he gave up the inheritance rights to the Qin family's company and insisted on becoming a doctor? Mo Jingshan's tone was mild. No. No. Then could it be that he was forced? Jinwan was shocked. Mo Jingshan did not reply. He lowered his gaze to see that when Jinwan cut the meat, the sharp knife would always brush past her fingers. Although her fingers were not cut, his brows still furrowed imperceptibly. He calmly said, Go to the back and pick some vegetables suitable for making a salad. You can just make a simple fruit and vegetable salad. All right. Hearing this, Jinwan placed the knife in her hand down. She washed her hands and turned to pick up her small vegetable basket to head out. In the backyard, Jinwan picked out various fresh vegetables. The kitchen was also quiet. Qin Siding leisurely lay on the sofa, preparing to sleep for a while before waking up to eat. In the end, the moment he closed his eyes, the sound of footsteps approached. His calf was abruptly kicked. Qin Siding opened his eyes to see Mo Jingshan holding a shining, silver kitchen knife in his hand. His gaze was cold and sharp. Come over and help me. Isn't there Jinwan? How am I supposed to help you? Qin Siding did not move. If you want to eat, then go in and cut the meat for me. Mo Jingshan coldly tossed down these words before turning to head back. Qin Siding rubbed his brows. He stood up and walked to the kitchen door with his arms crossed. He lazily said, My hand that holds the scalpel still needs to help you cut the meat? Why don't you let Jinwan finish cutting before going out? Mo Jingshin did not turn his head back. She's not suited to use a knife. Qin Siding rolled his eyes. If he was afraid that his woman would cut her fingers, he could just say it directly. He sounded so dignified as though no one could tell. I've discovered that ever since you had a woman, you've really broken through my understanding of you. The words wife-doting maniac really suits you. Mo Jingshin, you flatter me. Chapter 115. Finally, with the cooperation of the three of them, a feast was prepared. Although most of the dishes were vegetarian since the great CEO Mo was the chef, they would definitely not be simple dishes. What's more, Dr. Qin was personally in charge of the various fish and meat slices. This table was filled with color, aroma, and taste. It was so perfect that Jinwan wanted to take a photo and post it on her social media. It was a pity that there were no social media apps like WeChat or Weibo. However, Jinwan still secretly took 2 photos, planning to save them in her phone. Mo Jingshin saw her small actions and did not expose her, allowing her to take photos. Jinwan took the opportunity to add Mo Jingshin into the frame as well. With 2 clicks, the handsome head chef Mo and the smiling head surgeon Qin at the back formed a perfect group photo with the feast on the table. Can we eat now? Qin Siding pulled out a chair and sat down. Dr. Qin, do you want to test the poison first? Jinwan sat down and asked with a teasing smile. That's good too. Although Mrs. Mo's food doesn't taste very good, at least it won't poison me. However, the one cooking today is CEO Mo. Then that might not be the case. Qin Siding picked up his chopsticks and picked up the nearest dish, tasting it. As he chewed, he was silent for a long time. How is it? Is it delicious? Jinwan was like a grandma selling melons, showing off her husband's skills. With the great CEO Mo personally cooking, this kind of rare delicacy is definitely something that can only be encountered by luck. Qin Siding sneered, not answering if it was delicious or not. Didn't you say you were the one cooking? How did it become your man's chef? Jinwan pointed at the salad and fruit salad on the table. These 2 dishes count as well. What kind of dish is this? Qin Siding snorted as he picked up another vegetable leaf with salad dressing. After tasting it, his brows moved, but he remained silent for a long time. Jinwan smiled. My salad is seasoned with a secret recipe. It tastes different from the other salads you've eaten, doesn't it? Qin Siding furrowed his brows and finally gave up resisting. It's indeed not bad. Marriage is truly a magical thing. It can make the great Mo Jingshin willing to cook for a woman, and it can even make the pampered and unparalleled Miss Ji suddenly become a good wife and loving mother. So, Dr. Qin, don't always have a bitter and hateful attitude towards women. You should fall in love and get married. You'd better worry about yourself. Qin Siding sneered and glanced meaningfully at Jinwan. You haven't even figured out your own man's background, and you still want to pretend to be an emotional expert in front of me. The more mysterious a man is, the more charming he is. Anyway, he's my husband. No matter how unfathomable he is, he's still my husband. Jinwan rolled her eyes at him. Qin Siding snorted coldly. You're quite confident. Why weren't you confident when you jumped out the window last night? I was drunk last night, so I wasn't sober. Can you argue with a drunk person? Sophistry. Seeing that the 2 of them were about to start fighting, Mo Jingshin helplessly rubbed his brows. All right, even food can't stop your mouths. As he spoke, he placed a few dishes into Jinwan's bowl. Jinwan had long been hungry. She ignored Qin Siding's lukewarm and slightly mocking expression and picked up her bowl and chopsticks to eat. In the end, Qin Siding's appetite also increased and he ate a lot. Jinwan's heart was proud. She knew that even if Mo Jingshin was no longer a CEO, any restaurant he opened would be filled with guests because of the delicious food. Even a rich young master like Qin Siding, who had grown up with a golden spoon in his mouth, could be satisfied no matter how crafty his taste was. But he refused to admit it. TSK. While Jinwan and Qin Siding were fighting with their eyes, Mo Jingshin smiled mildly and did not speak. In the meantime, the phone on the table vibrated. He casually picked it up and saw that Mo Xiaoza had sent a message. His gaze calmly read the few lines on the screen, and a trace of coldness that was difficult to detect appeared in his eyes. At this moment, Qin Siding suddenly said, "The taste of the salad dressing you made is indeed very unique. Do you mind helping me make another plate of fruit salad?" Jinwan raised her brows, curling her lips at his sudden admitting defeat. She very generously stood up and headed to the kitchen. In the dining room that was separated from the kitchen by a wall, Qin Siding's gaze shifted toward Mo Jingshin, asking softly, "What is it?" Mo Jingshin's gaze was cold as he tossed his phone onto the table. Before the phone screen automatically darkened, Qin Siding glanced at it. Then, the moment the phone darkened, he calmly asked, "Is this a warning or a declaration of war?" Mo Jingshan did not speak, his gaze cold. Qin Siding understood and smiled playfully. "What do you plan to do? After all, this isn't the first time." Mo Jingshan raised his eyelids. After several seconds, he calmly spat out, "There won't be a second time." Qin Siding raised his brows. "Why don't you arrange someone skilled by Jinwan's side? Nanheng has several well-trained bodyguards under him." That night, Jinwan and Mo Jingshan stayed here. Before returning to the guest room to rest, she handed the pills she had specially brought over to Qin Siding. The last time she returned to the Ji home, she had used the excuse of her stomach feeling unwell to sneak into Ji Hongwen's room to retrieve these pills. To prevent others from noticing, she had only poured 1 or 2 pills into each bottle. However, these were sufficient for Qin Siding after a detailed examination. Qin Siding tossed the pills into a small transparent glass bottle. He turned back to see that Mo Jingshan was already preparing to bring Jinwan upstairs to rest. "I say, the two of you better not treat this place as a holiday villa. Pay attention to your manners. This old man is still staying downstairs." Qin Siding's brows revealed the strong unhappiness of a single dog at night. His tone was filled with warning. "The two of you are not allowed to make any noises in my house at night." "Jinwan?" Mo Jingshan glanced at him lightly and took Jinwan upstairs with his arm around her. The entire day Jinwan's mood was very relaxed. She also slept very well. As she slept early, she woke up early. The sky had just begun to brighten when she woke up. The morning sun was deep blue, and the sky had yet to brighten. She was about to get off the bed to pour herself a glass of water when she paused. She saw Mo Jingshan standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was dressed in a white shirt and black trousers. He had one hand in his pocket, slender and silent. He was still dressed in the same clothes as yesterday. Jinwan turned to look at the time on her phone. It was not even 6 o'clock. Could it be that he did not sleep the entire night? Jinwan was slightly surprised. She stood up and walked over. The moment she approached, Mo Jingshan turned around. Their eyes met. The man's deep, black eyes watched her face, sweeping across her brows. His voice was gentle and hoarse. "Why did you wake up so early?" Jinwan did not answer, asking in return, "You didn't sleep last night?" Chapter 116. How can I not sleep? Jinwan dragged him to the bedside, forcing him to sit on the edge of the bed. "Now sleep." Mo Jingshan smiled, holding her hand and placing her on his lap. He kissed the corner of her lips. "You've woken up and are full of energy. Aren't you afraid that I'll exhaust your energy again?" Jinwan turned and bit down on his lips. She lowered her voice to say, "Dr. Qin said that we're not allowed to make any noises. He drank last night and is still sleeping." Mo Jingshan kissed her lips once and then again. Jinwan had just woken up early in the morning. Afraid that she would be seduced by him to the point of doing something indescribable in Qin Siding's home, she rushed to press her hand against his chest. Her expression was serious. "By the way, I have to make a trip to the studio tomorrow." "And?" Mo Jingshan smiled mildly. "If you have any problems, remember to tell me. Don't bear it alone. Always remember that you have a husband. They're all small problems left behind by Han Tianyuan. I can handle those unpresentable dregs," Jinwan softly said. Mo Jingshan kissed her on the cheek again. It was a very warm kiss. After a moment, the man spoke softly and huskily, "Recently, Haicheng hasn't been peaceful. The Yu Garden's security is better. Move back to the Yu Garden." Jinwan's gaze swept past his calm, handsome face. She did not ask further. "All right then, let's go back." When Jinwan went downstairs, she saw that Qin Siding, who was supposed to head to the hospital early in the morning, was standing by the large window on the first floor. He held a glass of wine in his hand and was currently looking at another villa about 100 meters away. He had drunk last night. Early in the morning he actually still had wine in his hand. From this angle, she could only see that Qin Siding's back was indescribably dark and cold. He did not seem like the person who usually teased her or liked to tease her. Just his back view alone made him seem like a completely different person. Jinwan turned and returned upstairs. When she saw Mo Jingshan approaching, she raised her hand to her lips and made a shu expression. "Did Dr. Qin drink too much last night?" "It's already so late, but he hasn't gone to the hospital," Jinwan whispered. Hearing this, Mo Jingshan walked down the stairs. Seeing the scene in front of the window, his gaze indifferently swept toward the villa in front of him that no one had lived in for 4 whole years. There was a limousine parked outside the villa. The engraved iron gate in front of the villa was open, and a few people were moving luggage inside. From the color of the luggage, most of it was for women. With just a glance, Mo Jingshan continued downstairs. His tone was cold and carried a hint of mockery. "She's back. Aren't you going to greet her?" Qin Siding put down the wine glass in his hand and turned around. There was no trace of alcohol in his eyes, and his lips curved into a cold smile. "I have 2 surgeries this afternoon. I have nothing to do in the morning, so I need to sleep for a few hours to conserve my energy. Remember to close the door when you leave." As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and walked inside. Jinwan waited for Qin Siding to return to the bedroom before heading downstairs. She saw Mo Jingshan standing there with one hand in his pocket. His expression was indifferent, and he did not seem to be unhappy with Qin Siding's attitude. He also did not feel that it was inappropriate for him to be treated coldly. Jinwan could clearly see that Qin Siding's expression earlier was not normal. Mo Jingshan's expression was also unfathomable. On the way back to the Yu Garden, Jinwan leaned against the seat and flipped through the messages on her phone. In the end, she stopped at the last 2 messages that Xia Tian had sent her yesterday. "It can't be? Why did you suddenly want to transfer hospitals? It wasn't easy for me to gain some interest in Dr. Sheng. Jinwan, have you been hiding some evil intentions recently? Are you purposely trying to break my marriage?" "I'm so angry." Jinwan curved her lips. Since yesterday she had not replied. Xia Tian was most likely about to explode from anger. She opened the message page and tapped on the screen. "That's right. I came with the evil intentions of cutting off your rotten peach blossoms. Have you already transferred hospitals?" In less than half a minute, Xia Tian directly replied, "F***CK. You're only replying now. I thought that your sex life with Mo Jingshan had not ended since yesterday." Jinwan rolled her eyes and sent a disdainful emoticon over. "Xia Tian, yesterday I don't know where these cold and reserved lunatics in suits came from. The moment they arrived at the hospital, they immediately completed the procedures for me to transfer hospitals. They didn't even give me the slightest chance to resist. Right now, I'm lying on a hospital bed in the new hospital, missing my Dr. Sheng so much. Jinwan, he isn't suitable for you. Don't think about it. You've committed all kinds of rotten peach blossoms this year. Killing one is one. Don't be delusional enough to fall into the swamp of love so quickly, Xiatian. Weren't you the one who pushed Dr. Sheng to me? You even allowed him to chat with me in the hospital room. He caused me to fall in love. In the end, you're saying that he's also rotten?" "Jinwan," she held her forehead, "I was afraid that you would be harassed by that scum again. Considering that he's your main doctor, I allowed him to watch over you. Who knew that you would be so easily infatuated? Xia Tian, this is called being physically and mentally weak. My bones are all broken. Tell me, how weak am I? How weak am I? I lie here every day bored to the point of becoming moldy. Why can't I appreciate the various men passing by me? Sorry, the attack of men, forgive me for not being able to resist. Jinwan, your leg is broken but your head is still intact, right? It just so happens that my studio has some market analysis stuff that needs someone to handle. I'll send the computer over to you. While you're recuperating, help me share some of the workload. It just so happens that you're good at these things. Xia Tian, I'm heartbroken and you actually want me to work while I'm injured. Jinwan, it's precisely because you're heartbroken that you're using work to squeeze those useless thoughts out of your head. Besides, you've never been in love before. Why would you be heartbroken? Xia Tian, you're inhumane. Jinwan, from today onwards I'm your boss. You're to obediently analyze the information of Hai Cheng's real estate market. Your additional salary will be arranging for various good-looking male doctors to take care of you 24 hours a day. If you're not obedient, I'll have Mo Jingshan arrange for the ugliest doctor to harass you every day. Xia Tian, Jinwan, I'm breaking off all ties with you. I'm going to beat you to death. Jinwan, then you'll have to have the ability to jump now. After sending this message, she did not need to guess to know that Xia Tian was so angry that she smashed her phone. Jinwan smiled and called the studio. She asked Xiaoba to send a laptop to Xia Tian's ward. After arranging everything, the car had already arrived at the Yu Garden. Mo Jingshan was driving. Jinwan suddenly leaned over and said fawningly, I suddenly feel that your decisive decision to transfer Xia Tian to another hospital is really brilliant. The man glanced at her expression, pressed her brows and pushed her away. Sit back. You're disturbing my driving. Chapter 117. After entering the Yu Garden Villa, Xia Tian did not bother sending her any messages and directly called her. Jinwan answered the call while changing her shoes. She did not pay attention and pressed the hands-free button. In an instant she heard Xia Tian's roar through the phone. "I don't care. Since you broke off my marriage, you have to find me a man as handsome, tall, and skilled as Dr. Sheng within half a year. Otherwise, my wounded little heart will never be able to calm down." "Jinwan, I want a man. I want a handsome one. Jinwan, you have to compensate me with one." "Jinwan," Auntie Chen had just arrived at the door and heard the commotion. She almost could not hold back her laughter. Jinwan pursed her lips and rushed to press the hands-free button back. She picked up the phone and pressed it against her ear, lowering her voice. "Softer. How far do you want your loud voice to travel?" "Xia Tian. Damn, you didn't put it on hands-free earlier, did you?" "That's right." Jinwan turned to see Mo Jingshan, who had just entered the door, staring at her with a deep gaze. Jinwan pointed at the phone that had been hung up, explaining, "Xia Tian has been in the hospital for so long and is about to collapse from boredom. Right now she's really love-struck like a love-struck fool." Mo Jingshan was expressionless. "If I hear another word about the surname Sheng from her mouth, the Xia family will immediately come from S-City to bring her away. From today onwards she can forget about taking a single step into Haicheng. My conversations with her are always so vulgar. Don't take it to heart." Jinwan knew that if he said it he would definitely do it. Mo Jingshan indifferently curved his lips. He stared at her, speaking in a low and hoarse voice, "Stay away from those men who want to approach you, N?" His tone was calm and emotionless, but there was a hint of warning in it. The next day, Jinwan was in the Yu Garden study when 2 videos suddenly appeared in her mailbox. She clicked on them and glanced at them before directly closing them. She then curved her lips into a faint smile, but her eyes were colder. In the evening she received Mo Jingshan's call. She supported her chin with her hand as she glanced at the computer screen. At the same time she lazily and hoarsely said, "Why are you calling at this time? Don't tell me you're working overtime again?" Mo Jingshan chuckled softly, his clear and low voice ringing, "You're that afraid of being alone in an empty room? I just don't want you to work too late and drive back. After all, the Yu Garden is a little farther than Aolan International. Even if Mrs. Mo lives in the suburbs of Haicheng, I still have to go home." A smile immediately appeared on Jinwan's lips. Her voice was clear and pleasant. She asked gently, "Has the Shine Group's cooperation project ended?" Actually, she wanted to ask if Shuyan and Mo Xiaoza had already returned to the United States, but when the words were on the tip of her tongue, she changed the way she asked. Mo Jingshan did not reply. After a moment of silence he said, "Tonight, I'll bring you to meet someone. Be good and wait for me at home." Jinwan glanced at the time. "What time tonight?" "Before 6 o'clock. "Okay, but I have to go to the studio later. There's a little situation there. I'll probably be back in the evening." "Has your studio's financial crisis been resolved?" Jinwan paused for a moment. "It's all right. It's just a small problem. I can resolve it." Mo Jingshan was quiet for a few seconds. "Go early and come back early. Don't wander around for the next 2 days. Got it?" Jinwan could more or less guess the meaning behind his words. There must be a reason why he wanted her to return to the Yu Garden. Since he did not say, she did not ask. Before noon, Jinwan left the house and went straight to the studio. The moment she arrived at the studio, Xiaoba saw her and immediately ran over as though she had seen her savior. "Boss Wan, you're finally here. If you came any later, I would have been worried to death. What happened? Earlier on you were so flustered on the phone. Which investor came to create trouble?" Jinwan asked unhurriedly as she walked toward the office. The two arrived at the door. Before Xiaoba could speak, she suddenly heard a woman's voice coming from the office. Every word seemed to be filled with mockery and disdain. Jinwan stood outside the door and listened for a moment. She then pushed the door open and entered. "Call your current person in charge over immediately. The 30 million we invested back then has been reduced to zero in the blink of an eye. It hasn't even been half a year since we invested. We haven't even seen a single dividend, and your company has already changed owners. Right now you can't even take out the money. You even said that you've merged into some studio. From what I see, this is just an empty city hanging on the name of a studio." Jinwan saw the woman who was standing in front of the office table and pointing at the finance department's supervisor. That woman was around 30 years old. She was tall and beautiful, dressed fashionably, and maintained herself well. With one look, she could tell that she was either a manager of some company or a rich wife with a high net worth. Boss, she's CEO Jin. In the past, when CEO Han was still around, CEO Jin's company invested 30 million yuan here on account of their relationship with the Han Corporation. The contract was for 3 years. Every 6 months they would receive at least 20% interest. However, it has already been more than half a year. Right now, not only has the interest not been transferred to their company's account, even the money they invested is gone. Xiao Ba stood by Jin Wan's side, softly explaining the situation. CEO Jin? She's the person in charge of the company called Tianxing Investment? Jin Wan calmly asked. Xiao Ba nodded. That's right. CEO Jin, who was standing by the office table, noticed something behind her. She turned back to look at the person by the door. Xiao Ba was an intern assistant. CEO Jin's disdainful expression shifted away from her face and landed on Jin Wan. When she saw Jin Wan, her eyes narrowed. Jin Wan wore a white cashmere sweater. It was soft and comfortable, casually fitting to her body. The light brown coat she was wearing was also extremely low-key. She stood there calmly, glancing in CEO Jin's direction. Unlike the others who were submissive, there was a polite yet distant smile in her eyes. Of course, that smile was not very obvious. It was as light as a blink of an eye. CEO Jin coldly snorted. She placed the expensive international brand bag in her hands to the side and turned to seriously size up Jin Wan. Could you be the new boss that these people are talking about? Miss Gio? Hello, I'm Jin Wan. Jin Wan only replied with this one sentence. Her gaze was cold but not too distant. Unknowingly, she exuded a domineering aura that could control the situation. However, she restrained it well. Chapter 118. Who told you that our studio's finances are in the red? As Jin Wan spoke, her gaze shifted toward the supervisor of the finance department who was standing in her office. Supervisor Su of the finance department was a woman close to 30 years old. She wore a pair of glasses and her appearance was fair and refined. She had the demeanor of a white-collar elite. However, when Jin Wan's gaze landed on her, her eyes flashed, and she turned her head away in fear to avoid her gaze. CEO Jin pointed at Supervisor Su. Supervisor Su has already taken out all of the financial statements and the bank statements for the past 2 months. Although Miss G doesn't lack this 30 million, running a company isn't like playing house. You must return the money you owe. If you really can't return it, you can always reach out and ask your father for it. I don't care where you got the money from, but you must return it to me in its entirety. CEO Jin pointed at Supervisor Su. Jin Wan's tone was mild, and her lips carried a smile that did not reach her eyes. Since your company signed a 3-year investment contract with us, and you're taking it back after just half a year, are you planning on unilaterally terminating the contract? CEO Jin revealed an expression as though she knew she would say this. She glanced at the man behind her who was carrying a briefcase and coldly smiled. I knew you would say that. You want to use the contract to discuss the breach of contract with me, right? I'll leave my words here. Today, not only will I successfully terminate the contract, the money must also be transferred immediately. Otherwise, don't blame my lawyer for taking you guys to court. Let's see if this studio of yours can continue operating. From start to finish, Jin Wan appeared unaffected by CEO Jin. She walked over and picked up the 2 financial reports and bank statements. After taking a few glances, she abruptly turned to look at the supervisor of the finance department who had been quietly standing by the side. Supervisor Su, Jin Wan called out to her. Supervisor Su did not expect her name to be called. She was startled and turned toward Jin Wan. Miss G, these are all the conclusions you came up with today? Jin Wan asked. Supervisor Su lowered her head, appearing cautious and respectful as she answered, That's right. These are the debts that were left behind when CEO Han was still around. We've already deducted a portion of it from our liquid funds and paid it off. However, there's still a large portion that we still owe. CEO Jin called earlier and said that she wanted to come over to take a look. Yesterday, I worked overtime until very late to retrieve these financial reports. Worked overtime until very late? Jin Wan smiled faintly before shifting her eyes. Her tone was soft, and her emotions were hard to discern. CEO Jin, can you give me 20 minutes to chat with my supervisor? CEO Jin glanced at her with disdain, her face full of ridicule and ridicule. You can get 30 million just by chatting? There were a few people that CEO Jin had brought along standing in the office. A few of them could not help but burst into laughter. Their eyes were filled with mockery and ridicule, as though they were watching a mere 20-year-old girl putting on a monkey show in this business world where no blood was shed. She smiled as well. Ji was. Jin of. Gene of Gene. Gene comma Gene was G of Gene. Of G. G Gene of G. G of Nguyen Li, you're indeed young. I'm afraid you haven't weaned yourself yet. You're really indulging in fantasy. CEO Jean sneered. She walked to the leather sofa in the office and sat down. Raising her delicate eyebrows, she looked at the diamond watch on her wrist and coldly mocked. I'll give you 20 minutes. If you can't take out the 30 million I want after 20 minutes, we'll meet in court. Jean Wan's smile was calm. She held the documents in her hands and turned around. Supervisor Su, come with me. When they arrived at the office next door, Jean Wan placed the documents in her hands on the table. She turned back to look at Supervisor Su, who had just entered, with an indifferent gaze. The moment she met Jean Wan's gaze, Supervisor Su's footsteps immediately stiffened. Her eyes were slightly guarded. Miss G, what do you want to talk to me about? Talk about what? What do you think? Jean Wan stared at her with a smile. Your forgery skills are too inferior. Supervisor Su looked at her in surprise. What do you mean by that? What did I fake? Jean Wan picked up the receipt on the table and threw it in front of her. Did you think that after taking over the company for so many days, I was really just playing house? Supervisor Su glanced at her and softly explained, Of course I don't dare to think that way. But right now the debt deficit is a fact. When the company was in CEO Han's hands, it had already suffered a ridiculous loss. You can't come and settle the debt with me just because an investor has come knocking on our door. I'm only in charge of finance. It's not like I can generate money. If the money is gone, then it's gone. I can't possibly. Jean Wan's brows rose slightly. Her tone was clear and cold. A month ago, there was still around 30 million in the company's treasury. It was used to support the construction of new buildings in the south. This money in just a month's time disappeared into thin air? This 30 million was eaten by you? Supervisor Su's eyes flickered. She stammered, I'm not sure either. A month ago, Miss G, you hadn't taken over the company. That money might have been. Right now Han Tianyuan has been locked up, but he's still alive. It hasn't reached the stage where the dead can't testify. Jean Wan's voice was cold and did not yield in the slightest. You want to take advantage of the troubled times when the company is changing managers to embezzle the company's funds and take this money for yourself. You have to see who your new owner is. If you want to hide it from my eyes, I'm afraid you'll have to cultivate for a few more years. Supervisor Su suddenly panicked. She raised her voice to explain, Your words have no proof. Could it be that just because CEO Jean wants to sue the studio you're going to sell me out? You want me to be your scapegoat? You mean that I've wronged you? Jean Wan's face was expressionless. Since you're so confident, isn't it simple? You'll be sued eventually. Why don't I sue you as well and leave you until the police finish investigating? You want to call the police? Supervisor Su did not expect things to develop to this stage. Her palms were sweaty. Jean Wan unhurriedly said, Is there a need for me to call the police? CEO Jean is sitting next door. She has already brought a lawyer over. Perhaps she's prepared an even stronger backup plan. The police should be here soon. Supervisor Su bit down harshly on her lips. Her eyes reddened as she glared at her. She angrily said, Jean Wan, this company is yours. The one who's going to be sued is you. It has nothing to do with me. If you dare to make me a scapegoat, don't blame me for revealing the entire company's business system and secrets. Jean Wan sneered. All right. I want to see if you still have the guts to say those words to me when the evidence is placed before you. Manager Su's face paled. Evidence? What evidence? Chapter 119. Supervisor Su had thought that Jean Wan was just a spoiled rich young lady who had bought 2 companies with some spare cash. She would occasionally come to the company for a meeting, fire a few people, and display her might as a boss. Apart from that, she was just like Han Tianyuan, a piece of trash. However, Jean Wan's following words caused Supervisor Su to be unable to maintain her composure. Do you think that just because I don't come to the company, I won't understand the company's situation? I have eyes. I'll investigate and see. You're the head of the finance department. I'm afraid you won't be able to memorize the monthly analysis of the company's financial situation. But I can. Supervisor Su furrowed her brows in disbelief. Jean Wan coldly watched her. I know where every single cent is spent. And this 30 million yuan of liquid funds has already been transferred away a month ago. Do you think I haven't discovered this matter? Supervisor Su's eyes reddened. She took a deep breath and tried hard to hide her emotions. Supervisor Su, do you believe me? Ever since the first day I came here, I've already noticed you. I've been waiting for the time when you can't sit still anymore, Jinwan calmly said. At the same time, she took out her phone and data cable from her bag, connecting it to the computer on the table. Not long after, an indescribable video appeared on the computer, as well as the sounds of men and women unable to control themselves. The moment she saw the video on the computer, Supervisor Su turned to look at Jinwan. Her face instantly paled to the point where it lost all color. How did you, when the person in charge of the company was handing over his position, you took advantage of a loophole in the company's finances to embezzle more than 30 million yuan of liquid funds? This is a crime of theft. Jinwan crossed her arms, coldly leaning against the table. Her tone was slow and cold. And today you used CEO Jin to create trouble, not only to use this matter to escape, but also to make enemies between CEO Jin and CEO Jin. After all, even if I can't keep my studio, I still have the Ji family and the Mo family behind me. You wanted to use me to get rid of CEO Jin. Am I right? Supervisor Su's eyes widened. She stared at Jinwan as though she was looking at a monster. He couldn't believe it. How did she find out? Jinwan saw the trace of panic in Supervisor Su's eyes. It was extremely cold, and her exquisite facial features became cold and imposing. CEO Jin's husband slept with you before, and the two of you were so passionate that you could have sex in a small hotel that wasn't very safe. Otherwise, it would have been difficult to find such a video. Jinwan glanced at the paused image on the computer screen. The naked man and woman were entangled together, and their faces were very clear in the video. She then glanced at Supervisor Su, who appeared to have been petrified. Jinwan coldly said, CEO Jin's husband is rich and powerful. He's also quite good-looking. You love him so much that you can't extricate yourself. You plan to embezzle the money and leave the studio. You want to be with CEO Jin's husband, so you want to borrow my hands to get rid of him. What if I kill her directly because of a complaint about my studio? You killed two birds with one stone. That's a great way to kill two birds with one stone. When Supervisor Su spoke again, her voice was already trembling. She could no longer maintain her composure. Miss Ji, what exactly do you want? Do you admit to all of this? Jinwan's gaze was sharp as she retorted. What exactly do I have to do to make you delete the video? Supervisor Su did not dare to look at the frozen image on the screen. Her eyes were red, and her emotions were slightly out of control. I won't say any more useless words to you. Jinwan nimbly turned off the computer to avoid being blinded by the video. She kept her phone and unhurriedly said, if you want to be someone else's mistress, I don't care. I don't care about your relationship problems, but you have to return the 30 million yuan you took from here immediately. Immediately. Supervisor Su glared at her. Her complexion was pale as she suddenly said, the money has already been transferred to an overseas account. I have no way of retrieving it now. The moment her words landed, Jinwan took out a recording pen from her bag at almost the same time. You can choose not to return it. CEO Jin is right. I, Jinwan, really don't lack this 30 million yuan. Jinwan was unconcerned as she said, every single word you said earlier has already been recorded. Furthermore, it will be automatically transferred from this recording pen to my computer's data backup. As long as the police appear here, I'll hand this over to them. Then I won't have to worry about anything else. Not only will the money be returned, even your shameful act of interfering in someone else's marriage will be discovered by the police. When that happens, CEO Jin and her husband will most likely not let you off. Supervisor Su's entire body trembled. She stared at the recording pen in her hand and thought for a moment before saying hoarsely with bloodshot eyes, if I hand over the money, can you delete this recording and video? Jinwan placed her phone and recording pen back into her bag. Her gaze was calm and unperturbed. Low-class, greedy and foolish. Jinwan's voice was cold. With your intelligence, if you walk on the right path sooner or later, you will rise to the top. For a man with a family, you destroyed your own future and even broke the law for 30 million yuan. No matter what, you're in charge of finances. You're used to seeing money flowing like water. Could it be that you still don't understand how many people yearn for such ostentatious fame and fortune, and how many people despair? Supervisor Su bit her lips harshly. She first cried out, then cried until she sat on the ground. Her eyes were filled with fear and wariness as she looked toward Jinwan. Where's the money? Jinwan asked directly. She did not wish to waste any more time with her. Supervisor Su hesitated for a moment. Originally, she did not want to hand it over, but she was very mindful as she looked toward Jinwan's bag. The cell phone and recording pen in that bag could completely destroy her. She slowly took out a financial card with the Philippines logo. "It's here." Jinwan walked over, received it, and glanced at it. "Ah, you even know to transfer the money to an account in the Philippines. This kind of international money transfer method is indeed very difficult to investigate. Such a meticulous person, TSK as expected, you're destroying your own future." When Supervisor Su heard these words, she covered her face in tears. She then stared at Jinwan's bag with pleading eyes, as though she wanted nothing more than to destroy the recording pen and video. "I won't interfere with your dirty relationship transactions. But regarding the embezzlement of public funds, I will definitely hand it over to the police." Jinwan moved away from her, saying, "I still need to settle Seo Jin's side. I don't have time to waste with you here. Just wait for the police to come and interrogate you." Jinwan opened the door and walked out. She had the studio security guard the door to prevent Supervisor Su from escaping and causing unnecessary trouble. Chapter 120. When Seo Jin saw that Jinwan had returned, her smile was filled with mockery. "Miss Ji's expression seems very relaxed. Could it be that you really managed to conjure up 30 million yuan in these 20 minutes? Jinwan calmly handed the Philippine International Financial Card to Xiaoba and softly said, "First, check the amount of money in this card. Ask Supervisor Su for the password. She's next door." Xiaoba nodded and quickly walked out with the card. "What's that?" Seo Jin seemed to have noticed something. She stood up and approached, but Xiaoba had already left with the card without turning back. "Seo Jin, don't be anxious. If you plan on taking away the money you invested back then, of course I won't forcefully hold it back." Jinwan calmly glanced at her. Seo Jin glanced at her. "Miss Ji, don't blame me for being too ruthless. Back then, I only invested some money into Han Tianyuan's company because of the Han Corporation. Now that the boss has changed and I don't have any relations with your Ji family, of course I have to take back the money." "I know." Jinwan spoke and turned to open the laptop on her desk. She then opened a PowerPoint presentation she had personally prepared. "It's not that I can't satisfy Seo Jin's request to terminate the contract. If you insist on terminating our partnership today, no matter what, I won't forcefully stop you." Jinwan smiled lightly. "But before you make your final decision, Seo Jin, why don't you take some time to take a look at this?" Seo Jin walked over and glanced at the contents of the laptop disapprovingly. "Seo Jin should know of the properties and land resources under construction under our studio's name. For example, this piece of land in the southern part of the city. It's only a street away from the bustling area in the southern part of the city. 2 years ago, the price of this piece of land had already reached a sky-high price. When this area was first built, the pre-sale price had already exceeded 20,000 yuan per square meter. Although this year the domestic real estate industry has been declining by more than half, and the price here has been dropping by around 5,000 yuan, based on the current construction progress, this area will only be completed by next summer. The prices of the other properties nearby are all lower by half. Furthermore, because the prices have been dropping, the sales of the properties are very good." "And so?" Seo Jin crossed her arms. "Boss Jin, you shouldn't have been a Haiqing local, right?" Jinwan turned to look at her. "If you're from Hai City, you should be well aware of the ratio between the rich and the poor in Hai City. You should also know that the base number of migrant workers is increasing at an extremely high percentage every year. In Hai City, the upper class with a net worth of more than 1 billion yuan accounts for 37% of the country's population. All the rich areas in Hai City are overcrowded. This price of more than 20,000 yuan per square meter is within the acceptable range for most people, but they are currently in a wait-and-see state." Jinwan turned to the next page of the PowerPoint. "As an investor, I can understand that you are not optimistic about the current property industry. However, based on the surrounding environment of the residential area under my studio's name, as well as the analysis of the surrounding per capita income, it is very clear that once the unreasonable talk of a property bubble is gradually forgotten, not to mention this residential area's price of 20,000 yuan per square meter, even if it were to rise to 30,000 yuan per square meter, there would still be a large number of people fighting over it. If we add on the hunger sales model, it is destined that the land and property under my studio's name will have room for growth. It will not end up as you think, losing everything." Seo Jin disapprovingly snorted. "I remember that when Han Tianyuan first registered these two companies, he invested a lot of money. Adding on the purchase of land and the construction of properties, he invested quite a bit more. In the end, because the property industry was becoming more and more depressed, He only sold the company to you for 30 million yuan. As she spoke, Xiao Jin narrowed her eyes. The money I invested is already enough to buy your current studio. Yet, you're still speaking to me confidently about how the property prices will continue to soar in the future? Do you think that you're a prophet, that it will definitely rise just because you say so? Han Tianyuan sold the company to me for 30 million yuan because he doesn't know how to do business. Opening 2 companies and squandering money for fun, it won't be too much of a pity to sell them off. Jinwan smiled mildly. Right now, if CEO Jin offers 5 times the price to buy my studio, I'm afraid I won't agree. Ha! Who doesn't know how to boast? In the future, this will be a losing business. If you want to continue losing money, that's your business. I don't wish to continue participating in this investment. I want to take my money back. Can you stop me? I won't stop you. My words will only go so far. Jinwan maintained an indifferent expression the entire time. The office door opened and Xiaoba returned with a card. She handed it to Jinwan and softly whispered a number into her ear. Jinwan placed the card on the office table. The money is here. I can also personally cancel the contract with you. Previously, it was merely a member of my finance department who embezzled public funds. We'll settle this sort of internal matter ourselves. The money has already been taken back. Previously, the figures and receipts that the finance department showed you were all fake. CEO Jin still insists on terminating the contract, is that right? Yes. CEO Jin looked at Jinwan with disdain. A studio that is destined to lose money is not worth me spending a single cent to play a childish game with you. All right. Jinwan raised her brows. Then have your lawyer bring the contract termination agreement over. I'll take a look. If there's no problem, we'll directly terminate our partnership. Boss Jin gave the lawyer behind her a look, and the lawyer hurriedly took his briefcase and walked forward quickly. Half an hour later, Jinwan signed the contract termination agreement. Director Jin held the agreement and the financial card that had already been verified. She smiled smugly and looked around the office. She said sarcastically, even if you successfully bring this money back to me, I'm afraid that your liquid funds will be zero right now, right? The buildings under the studio's name have yet to be completed. What are you going to use to continue building? With this lousy place of yours, there won't be any investors who will look favorably upon it. Forget about other things, you won't even be able to afford the advertising fees for future sales. After finishing her words, CEO Jin smiled mockingly and turned to leave. Xiaoba stood behind Jinwan, angrily glaring at CEO Jin's back. Just as CEO Jin was about to step out of the door, several people dressed neatly in suits suddenly entered the studio. They did not look simple at all. May I ask which one of you is CEO Ji? The young man dressed in a black suit at the very front asked politely the moment he entered. Jinwan glanced at them, hiding the trace of doubt in her eyes. She answered, I am. CEO Jin was originally about to leave. When she saw this scene, she curiously turned back to watch this scene. Hello, CEO Ji. We are the representatives of the MO Corporation's CE International Investment Agency. We represent the MO Corporation to sign a contract with your studio. Hearing these words, everyone in the office was instantly stunned. Jinwan blinked. Sign a contract? That's right. The MO Corporation will invest $200 million in your studio. Xiaoba and the people in the office were instantly shocked to the point their jaws dropped. $200 million? CEO Jin, who had yet to leave, was also stunned. Her eyes were filled with shock. Chapter 121. Heavens, heavens, heavens. As expected of Boss Nguyen's husband. What a timely rain. Xiaoba stood behind Jinwan, filled with excitement. $200 million? Are you sure you're not joking? CEO Jin's expression was confused. Her eyes were filled with disdain. Could it be that Miss Ji was afraid of losing face and hired 2 extras to support you? This time Xiaoba glared at CEO Jin confidently. Some people shouldn't look down on others, all right? It seems like CEO Jin is indeed not a Haicheng local. You don't even know that our CEO Ji is the wife of the MO Corporation CEO. CEO Jin immediately stared at Jinwan in astonishment before shifting her gaze to Xiaoba. She then stared at the 2 representatives from the CE Investment Agency who clearly did not look like fake actors. Although CEO Jin's family's company was in Haicheng, she was often abroad. Each time she returned, she would only stay for a few days before leaving. The company was managed by her husband. She only knew of Haicheng's 4 prominent families and that this Jinwan was the Ji family's daughter. Right now, the Ji family was no longer as stable as they were a few years ago in the upper class. A mere identity as the G family's daughter did not have much of an impact. But MO Corporation, of course she had heard of it. CEO Jean paused for a moment before shifting her gaze to the two CE investment agency investors. Are you for real? The two did not even glance at her. They continued to politely face Jean Wan. COG, please forgive us for coming uninvited. The investment contract has already been drafted before we came. Please take a look. They handed the contract over. Jean Wan hesitated for a moment before accepting it. She was actually quite shocked. This CE investment agency was the largest investment company in Haicheng in the past 10 years. It had many well-known cooperation cases with many of the world's top 100 companies. Right now, CE Investment Agency was already under the MO Corporation's name. Jean Wan's original plan was to sell the 2 or 3 properties and idle cars under her name for tens of millions of yuan so that she could continue to build those properties. She still had the inheritance her mother left her before she passed away. Although it was not much, it was enough for her to temporarily solve the current situation. After all, the money could be earned back in the future, so she had been steady and orderly. She only dealt with the personnel changes in the studio and was not very anxious about the money. She didn't expect that Mo Jingshan had already known her financial situation like the back of his hand. Not only did he send the most authoritative investment agency to sign a contract with her, but the contract even clearly indicated the budget of the land and real estate projects under her studio's name, which not only saved her a lot of trouble, but also directly pointed out a clear path for her. Is this arranged by your CEO Mo? Jean Wan looked up after reading it. The tall man, who was one of the representatives, nodded and smiled at her modestly. We know COG's concerns. In fact, you can think of it this way. What our investment organization values is the market prospects and the profits we can reap in the future. Even if COG has no relationship with MO Corporation, we will screen and plan the nearby real estate companies and find the most suitable company to invest a sum of money in. Mo Jingshan really understood her well. These two people's words were really watertight and logical. They managed to expose Mo Jingshan's true relationship with her, and at the same time, they managed to save her face. I'll have to trouble the two of you to wait in the VIP lounge. Jean Wan was silent for a moment before nodding at them. She then turned to look at CEO Jean, who was still standing by the door. CEO Jean, is there anything else? From afar, CEO Jean had seen the logo on the contract in Jean Wan's hands. It was indeed the anti-counterfeiting logo of the CE Investment Agency. The people from CE personally came to sign the contract and directly showed them the anti-counterfeiting logo. From this, it could be seen how much importance they placed on this studio. In an instant, CEO Jean felt that the card in her hand that she had just asked for back was burning hot. She changed her mocking expression and said with an awkward smile, Miss G, I haven't looked through the PowerPoint you showed me earlier. Actually, it's not that we can't continue working together, but I'm not too confident in the domestic real estate market. Why don't we find some time to specifically talk about this? Jean Wan glanced at her. Earlier, I've already asked CEO Jean to reconsider. I've asked you again and again if you're sure you want to terminate the contract. CEO Jean felt as though her face had been slapped loudly. However, if Jean Wan truly had the backing of the MO Corporation, then this so-called studio would definitely not close down. Furthermore, the MO Corporation also had the illustrious Haicheng MO family behind it. That was the MO family. Earlier I was indeed in the wrong. My emotions were a little extreme, and I said a few angry words in a moment of hot-headedness. Actually, I've thought about it carefully. The real estate market is indeed what everyone needs the most. Although we've just signed the contract, we're terminating the previous investment contract with CEO Han. I think it's a good time to re-sign the contract with the new Mo Wan studio. Jean Wan smiled lightly at her, but her voice was directed at Xiao Ba, who had a disgusted expression. Xiao Ba, send the guest out. When Xiao Ba heard this, she instantly felt extremely satisfied. She nodded her head forcefully. All right. As she spoke, she walked forward and smiled at CEO Jean, who was gradually losing her composure. She extended her hand toward the slightly opened office door and gestured for her to enter. CEO Jean, take care. CEO Jean also wanted her face. However, the moment she thought that she might have offended Jean Wan, as well as the Mo family or Mo Corporation, her heart trembled. Although she came here today to retrieve the 30 million yuan, she had unknowingly brought trouble to her own company. She then saw that Jean Wan clearly did not intend to continue talking to her. Her attitude remained calm and indifferent, causing her to be unable to understand what was going on. She instantly felt anxious in her heart. Miss G, regarding the cooperation, we can really discuss it again. If you have any dissatisfaction toward me, I can get my husband to personally re-sign the contract with you. CEO Jean decided to lower her stance and looked toward Jean Wan with a face full of smiles. Jean Wan chuckled lightly. Her tone was unhurried and meaningful. Right now, I'm afraid your husband won't have the time to care about such matters. CEO Jin's expression was surprised. It was clear that she did not understand the hidden meaning behind her words. However, the hint of mockery and meaning still caused CEO Jin to instinctively furrow her brows. Not wanting to waste any more time, Jin Wan gave Xiaoba another look. Xiaoba directly went to open the office door. She then turned to look at the conflicted CEO Jin. CEO Jin, please. The intention to chase her away was extremely obvious. No matter how thick-skinned she was, she could tell that right now Jin Wan was not going to give her any chance to continue talking about the cooperation. Chapter 122. Serves her right. Who asked her to look down on us? No wonder she dared to bring her lawyer over to forcefully terminate the contract. It turns out that she didn't even investigate our studio's background and dared to bully us. Xiaoba spat at the door. She turned back to see Jin Wan standing there with a pensive expression. Boss Wan, are we really going to receive a $200 million investment? Xiaoba's eyes were filled with anticipation. She jogged back as though she wanted to hug her thigh, moving closer to Jin Wan's side. Jin Wan was silent for a moment before saying, "Go call the police and have them bring Supervisor Su away. She's suspected of embezzlement and other business crimes. We need to investigate them carefully. Hand her over to the police station first." Xiaoba was shocked. She then asked in a voice that only Jin Wan could hear, "A few days ago, you asked me to investigate Supervisor Su's personal situation. Did you already suspect her?" Jin Wan glanced at her indifferently. "With your reaction speed, you probably won't even understand what's going on when the company is sold. Why are you trying to act smart with me now? I'm asking you to call the police, so hurry up and do it." Xiaoba looked at her with a wronged expression. Her hands moved quickly as she picked up her phone and called the nearby police station. 2 hours later. Because she had signed a contract worth $200 million with CE International Investment Agency, this small studio under Jin Wan's name, which was originally unknown, had become the small studio with the highest amount of funding in Haicheng. In this hour, the phone on Jin Wan's desk was about to explode from the calls. Most of them were from previous investors who suddenly called to show concern about the studio's situation. They even said they wanted to arrange a time to meet with Jin Wan to discuss the investment. Some even expressed their sincerity through the phone, saying that they had always felt that Han Tianyuan was unreliable. After Jin Wan took over, they had always looked forward to working with Jin Wan and so on. After receiving too many calls, Jin Wan finally had a moment of peace. She was about to pour herself a glass of water when all of a sudden, the phone in her pocket vibrated. She picked it up and saw that it was Mo Jingshan. Earlier, Jin Wan was afraid that he was busy and did not look for him. Now he actually took the initiative to call her. She returned to her desk and sat down. She picked up the phone and said, "Why didn't you tell me in advance that you suddenly sent 2 people from CE Investment to sign a contract with me? You threw money at me without saying a word. You scared me to death, okay? Why are you so timid? It's just an investment cooperation." The man's voice came from the other end of the phone. His voice was deep and sexy. Jin Wan couldn't help complaining to him about the bunch of phone calls she had just received, as well as the disgusting faces of those people. Then she said, "The key is that those who originally intended to withdraw their investment are now fighting to continue to invest. I'm just a studio. If this continues, the amount of financing will be enough for me to set up a shareholding company." Mo Jingshan smiled mildly. "Mrs. Mo is ambitious and has a bright future. I have to help you." "Boss Missouri, this isn't just a helping hand." Since the contract had been signed, Jin Wan was not in the mood to be delicate. She said bluntly, I suddenly feel a little pressured." "Pressured is a good thing. This proves that Mrs. Mo hasn't lost her direction," Mo Jingshan said calmly. Mo Jingshan spoke calmly, "You know very well that I sent CE's people over and did not go personally. There was also a contract signed in the middle. You should know that this investment wasn't placed in your hands for nothing." "Of course I know." Jin Wan held her chin, leaning against the table. She pressed the phone to her ear, her voice clear and gentle. "So, although it seems like I've received such a high investment, in reality, I'm actually in debt of $200 million. Furthermore, the contract that CE people gave me also included a guarantee. Within 5 years my profits will be doubled. Otherwise I can withdraw my investment at any time. Mo Jingshan calmly said, "It's good that you know." Jin Wan held her forehead. The people in the studio were currently celebrating the generous investment they had just received. Only she was clear that she had a huge debt on her, and the creditor was her husband. The methods that Mo Jingshan had used today without batting an eyelid, every step that he had taken was impossible for her to reject. Business was official, and the contract was signed by CE's people. None of this was child's play. Thus, Mo Jingshan still respected her initial wishes and did not interfere. This investment he really did not give it for nothing. Hearing the little woman lying on the table and sighing, Mo Jingshan softly chuckled. "Previously, weren't you very confident in the future property industry in the country? I still have confidence. But suddenly the pressure is huge. This isn't a small case like tens of millions. It's only doubled in 5 years. What? You don't dare to accept it?" "I've already signed it. Of course I dare." Mo Jingshan chuckled lightly. "All right, go home early. I'll pick you up at the U Garden before 6. After work, Jin Wan drove back to the U Garden as promised. After alighting from the car, she was still thinking about the studio. She walked into the U Garden, opened the door to the villa, and closed the door without turning back. She threw her bag on the table, changed her shoes and entered the living room on the first floor. She took off her coat. The U Garden was huge. Not mentioning the floors above, just the living room on the first floor was over 200 square meters. Including the kitchen, dining room and guest rooms, the total area was over 400 square meters. And at this moment this place to Jin Wan was suddenly too spacious and quiet. At this time the usually warm and considerate Auntie Chen actually did not come out to welcome her. The servants who usually walked around on the first floor were also not around. Perhaps using the word spacious was not appropriate. But it was unusually quiet. Jin Wan casually raised her eyes, scanning the living room in front of her. She felt that something was wrong. Earlier, when she entered the door, she had already sensed that something was amiss. Earlier on, when she drove back not far from the U Garden, there seemed to be a black Jeep parked there. The model of the car had never appeared in this area before, and the license plate was something she had never seen before. It was just that she did not pay too much attention to it. Now that she thought of it, she abruptly raised her eyes to look at her surroundings. She instinctively took a step back, until she vaguely sensed danger approaching. She bent down to pick up her bag from the ground. Without even changing her shoes, she decisively turned to run out. And at this moment, 2 unfamiliar men hiding in the corner of the first floor suddenly rushed out at a rapid speed. They were like ferocious beasts waiting for an opportunity to hunt in the bushes. When the time was ripe, they began to bare their fangs. Just as Jin Wan was about to open the door and shout for help, they dragged her back in. Chapter 123. Help? You? The 2 men forcibly pressed Jin Wan down. One skillfully restrained her arms behind her back, while the other quickly covered her mouth with a wet cloth. They were well trained and professional, making it impossible for her to dodge. Although Jin Wan was prepared, she was still restrained in less than a second. Her mouth was covered harshly, and she could not even utter a complete sentence. You. In her struggle, she tried to remember the appearance of the 2 men, but before she could see them clearly, her head was pressed down harshly. Their rough fingers pressed down on an extremely vulnerable spot on the back of her neck, causing blood to rush to her brain and her vision to blur. It was difficult to even focus her eyes. "Miss G, we're only following orders. Please cooperate. Otherwise we can't guarantee that we won't hurt you," the man who held her down said in a rough and ruthless voice. Jin Wan stiffened and did not resist desperately. The 2 men quickly brought her out. Her mouth was covered with force so she could not cry out. Soon she was pushed into the back seat of the black Jeep. Only after the door was closed did Jin Wan breathe freely. She turned to see that the back seat and the front seat were completely separated. There was a solid metal plate in the middle and she could not see what was happening in front. The rear doors and windows were also sealed shut, and the only door that could be opened was locked from the outside in an instant. Jin Wan raised her hand and twisted the door several times in vain. No matter how she hit or kicked, it would not open. The car window was reinforced with a black film. The people outside could not see inside and the people inside could not see outside. It was a vast expanse of darkness. "Who on earth are you? Let me out of the car." Jin Wan turned around and slapped the metal plate in front of her. She did not know if the people in front heard her, but no matter how she yelled or slapped, she could not hear any sound. She could only feel that the car had started the engine and was driving away from the U garden at an extremely fast speed. Who sent these people to kidnap her? The security in the U garden was so perfect. Why were the people at home suddenly not here? Would Auntie Chen and the others be alright? Even though she knew it was futile, Jinwan still slapped the door hard for a long time. There was no sound at all in front. It was clear that the metal plate was soundproof. Jinwan leaned against the metal plate weakly. Boundless darkness and unknown fear surrounded her. Her hands and feet gradually turned cold. She stared at a spot in the darkness and slowly narrowed her eyes. To be able to sneak into the U garden without a trace and without the slightest feeling of chaos in the house, it was most likely the Ji family or the Mo family. After all, only these two families would Auntie Chen not suspect them and would let them in. Mo Jingshan told her not to wander around these days and to go home early was more or less reminded her that she would be in danger. Recalling the scene when she was locked in the bathroom that day, Jinwan could roughly sense that Mo Jingshan's father, Mo Xiaoza, was a person who would not rest until he achieved his goals. As long as he wanted to do something, even if it meant offending Mo Jingshan, even if his methods were ruthless and unacceptable, he would not hesitate to do it. Just now, when the two men restrained her, they had warned her, but apart from taking her away, they did not seem to have any intention of harming her. Jinwan was most likely Mo Xiaoza. Jinwan's originally panicked heart gradually calmed down. No matter what Mo Xiaoza was planning to do, it would definitely not endanger her life. The Mo family and the Ji family were both prominent families in Haicheng. With Mo Jingshan in the mix, Mo Xiaoza would not dare to kill anyone. As the car drove, the surroundings were dark. It was impossible to tell how much time had passed. Every minute and second felt like an entire year. Jinwan closed her eyes in dizziness because of the increasingly scarce air behind the car. Regardless of Mo Xiaoza's motive, she had to conserve her energy first before she could face him with a clear mind. After an unknown amount of time, she finally heard the car door open. Jinwan opened her eyes. She squinted because of the strong light outside the car, but before she could clearly see the appearance of the two, she was abruptly dragged out by them. They still pressed her down and covered her mouth. However, this time Jinwan's resistance was much weaker. She only made two woo-woo sounds before she was brought in. The two nimbly pushed her into a room. Jinwan stumbled and fell to the floor inside. Her arms hurt when they hit the ground. She forced herself to sit up and looked up at the door that was quickly closed. "Miss Ji, please stay here for a night. Tomorrow morning we'll send you back." The voices of the two came from outside the door, followed by the sound of their footsteps leaving. Jinwan rushed to the door, but it was already locked from the inside. The door in front of her was made of high-grade wood. It was very sturdy. If it was locked from the inside, it would be impossible to break it open without hard tools. Jinwan's hand paused on the door. She abruptly turned back to look at the dark room. Although she could not see clearly, she felt that the floor she fell on was of good quality. This place did not seem like a place that kidnappers would use because it was very high-grade. She tentatively raised her hand and felt around the wall by the door. When she found the light switch, she pressed it with a pause sound. The light in the room suddenly turned on. Although it was not a glaring light, it was a soft light that allowed one to see everything clearly. What entered her eyes was a very luxurious guest room. It had all the daily necessities including a bathroom. There was a large bed in the center of the room. Although it looked elegant and exquisite from the furnishings, it was indeed a guest room. Directly opposite there was a window behind the curtains. Jinwan quickly walked over and pulled open the curtains. The sky outside was already dark. She estimated that it was at least 7 or 8 in the evening. The window was not a floor-to-ceiling window, but an ordinary square window. This was the 3rd floor of an unknown villa. It was not particularly tall, but the window was explosion-proof and could not be broken. The only small window that could be opened was also locked. She had thought that the mastermind behind the kidnappers had made a mistake and thought that they could escape through the window. The glimmer of hope that had just been ignited was once again shattered. Jinwan stood by the window and looked out. She saw the large swimming pool behind the villa and the surrounding flower beds full of life. Was there someone living here now? This window faced the back of the villa. There was no road behind, nor were there any people or cars passing by. Even if the lights were on in the room, no one would be able to see her if she stood by the window and made a gesture of knocking on the window for help. There was no way to escape. Jinwan paced back and forth in the room. Chapter 124. Jinwan hugged her legs as she sat by the window, staring at the sky outside. Being locked up here, time seemed to have stopped. It was only when she vaguely heard the sound of a car approaching that she abruptly stood up. She turned and rushed to the door, pressing her ear against it. This was the third floor. She could not hear the movements on the first floor clearly, but she did hear a loud knock on the door. Then there were footsteps approaching from the first floor. Jean Wan raised her hand and tried to knock on the door twice, wanting to remind the person rushing over that she was locked up here. You still have the strength to knock on the door. Did you think the person who came was Jing Shin? All of a sudden, a voice that was slightly unfamiliar to Jean Wan came from outside. That voice carried the experience and low voice of a middle-aged man. His tone was cold and even a little disdainful. Jean Wan's hand immediately froze on the door. Miss Ji, I'm Mo Jingshin's father. Today I invited you here to stay for a night. I have no intention of harming you. After tomorrow you'll be free. In Mo Xiao's words, the so-called freedom, Jean Wan could clearly hear another layer of meaning. She was silent for a moment before raising her voice to say, since you're Jing Shin's father, I should call you Dad in name. We're a family. Why did you lock me up? This Dad, I can't accept it. Mo Xiaoza coldly said, Jing Shin has more important things to do tonight. He doesn't have time to deal with your problem. You can stay here in peace. Where is Mo Jingshin right now? Jean Wan instinctively had a bad premonition. From today onwards, his whereabouts have nothing to do with you. You can only stay here today. Don't run out and ruin his plans. After coldly saying this, Mo Xiaoza directly left the door. He did not plan on saying another word to her. At the same time, there was the sound of a car approaching. Jean Wan suppressed the layers of uneasiness in her heart and leaned against the door to listen carefully. Not long after, she heard what sounded like the sound of a walking stick hitting the ground. Following that, Elder Mo's angry roar rang from the staircase. You locked that G-brat here, didn't you? Let her out right now. It was Grandfather Mo. Jean Wan frantically knocked on the door. Grandfather. I'm here. Grandpa. There was a short silence outside. She was on this floor, so Grandfather Mo might not be able to hear her. Outside, Elder Mo raised his voice and scolded, Xiao Zhe. No matter how much power you have in America, don't forget that Hai Qing still has me and Jing Shin. If I want you to leave Shine, all I need to do is say the word. You don't even listen to your own father now, do you? Elder Mo angrily roared. He had rushed here in a hurry and his words were rough. Jean Wan and Jing Shin's relationship is very good. If you dare to force this loving couple to live the rest of their lives in torment, don't even think about entering the Mo family's doors in this lifetime. I don't recognize you as my cruel and merciless son. Father, please calm down. Mo Xiaoze had already descended. His tone was neither fast nor slow. It's already this late. The setup that should be set has already been set. The people who should be involved have already entered. Even if you fly over now, it'll be useless. Jing Shin can't stay in the country forever. Many years ago, he had his own achievements in America. In the future, when he inherits Shine, he will stay in America for a long time. In this huge Hai Cheng, a mere daughter of the Ji family is completely unsuitable for him. Whether he's suitable or not is Jing Shin's own choice. Did you really think that back then Jing Shin and Jean Wan's marriage was completely arranged by me? If Jing Shin hadn't agreed to it himself, even if I held a knife to his neck, he wouldn't have married her. Elder Mo said harshly. So what? Back then when Jing Shin left America, I already warned him. If he wasn't so hard to control, I wouldn't have used such a method. He belongs to Shine. He can't be limited to this Hai Ching forever. If he wants to leave, he has to break away from Jean Wan, an unimportant shackle. Mo Xiaoze's reply was cold and arrogant, leaving no room for negotiation. Bullsh*T. You kidnapped Jean Wan, drugged your own son, and locked him in a hotel room within Shuyan. Did you learn such despicable methods from those Americans? Hearing these words, Jean Wan, who had been quietly standing by the door, felt as though she had fallen into an icy lake. Her blood from head to toe lost all warmth. Since I've sent Shu Yen to Hai Cheng, I don't plan on sending her back to the Yin family in America. She must marry Jing Shin. Mo Xiaoze's tone was cold and arrogant. You're already old. There's no need to worry about the marriage of the younger generation. As long as we successfully get through tonight, perhaps Shu Yan's stomach will have the great-grandson you've longed for day and night. Pa, are you trying to force Jing Shin to his death, or are you trying to force me to my death? Mo Xiaoze was cold and indifferent. Father, you came here. Even if you can bring Jean Wan away, what can you do? Before I came back, Jing Shen and Shu Yan had already been together in the room for more than half an hour. Right now, even more time has passed. That kind of drug, not to mention Jingshin's hot-blooded age, even someone like you in your 70s or 80s would not be able to withstand it. You bastard. Elder Mo abruptly raised his walking stick and viciously struck Mo Xiaozhe. How could I have a son like you? Immediately call the people over there to release Jingshen and Shu Yan. I can't watch as Jingshen is destroyed by you. It's too late. The drug takes effect quickly. No man can withstand it. If you open the door now, you'll undoubtedly be interrupting Jingshen's good time. You unfilial son. I really regret not strangling you to death in your swaddling clothes 50 years ago. Mo Xiaozhe sneered disapprovingly. If I die, where will you find such a good grandson in the future? Elder Mo angrily swatted him away with his walking stick and rushed upstairs. Where did you lock Jinwan up? Mo Xiaozhe saw that the elder had already gone up to the 3rd floor. It was clear that he had heard Jinwan's incessant knocking on the door. His eyes were cold and displeased. However, because the elder had already found his way over, he coldly followed up. Jinwan was behind the door. Her lips had already been bitten until they bled. She forcefully knocked on the door. Grandfather, I'm here. The sound of the walking stick and hurried footsteps approached at the same time. Elder Mo stepped forward and used his walking stick to hit the door harshly. He flew into a rage and turned back to glare at Mo Xiaozhe. If you don't release Jinwan today, if you dare to let anything happen to either Jingshen or Jinwan, this old man will directly die in front of you. Father. Mo Xiaozhe's expression was cold. Chapter 125. If this old man can't save my grandson and granddaughter-in-law today, I'll drag you, my own son, down with me. Elder Mo's anger shook the heavens as he turned and charged toward the staircase. Mo Xiaozhe saw that he was serious and immediately furrowed his brows. Jinwan can be released, but even if you bring her to look for Jingshin now, the result will be the same. Why do you have to do this? F***ck your mother's bullshit. Jingshin definitely won't touch the infamily's girl. Elder Mo harshly said. Are you going to release her or not? Do you want me to place righteousness before family and beat you, this unfilial son, to death? Will you only let this matter rest after the Mo family is destroyed? Mo Xiaozhe was silent for a moment before abruptly shifting his gaze toward the bodyguard at the staircase. The bodyguard nodded and took the key to open the door to Jinwan's room. The crisp sound of the door being unlocked rang. In the next moment, Jinwan forcefully twisted the door open and rushed out. She immediately saw Mo Xiaozhe standing in the corridor with an ugly expression. Her entire face was slightly pale as she turned to look at Elderim. Gee brat. Are you hurt anywhere? Quickly tell grandfather. Elder Mo walked over shakily with the support of his walking stick. His eyes were filled with heartache. Jinwan's lips were stained with blood from her own biting. She silently stared at the elder for a long time. After confirming that the elder's expression of anger and heartache was real and that he was not joking, she suppressed the surging emotions in her heart and tried to ask calmly, Grandfather, what you said earlier, is it true? Knowing that she had heard it, Elder Mo closed his eyes. It was clear that he did not want her to feel too uncomfortable. He softly comforted her. Don't worry. I believe in Jingshin. He will definitely be able to endure it. Mo Xiaozhe's gaze was dark and cold. Father, you've already seen her. Can you be at ease now? Elder Mo turned back to scold him. Mo Xiaozhe had already called for the bodyguard. Send the elder back to the Mo residence. You're only letting me go back? No, Jinwan has to leave with me. Elder Mo held onto his walking stick with one hand and quickly reached out with the other. He grabbed Jinwan's wrist and pulled her behind him. His aged and slightly hunched body shielded Jinwan behind him. Jinwan looked at the elder in front of her but could not say a word. Her eyes were cold as she stared at the expressionless Mo Xiaozhe. Mo Xiaozhe ignored Jinwan's gaze and said coldly, I let you see her to prove that she is indeed unharmed here, but before tomorrow morning she can't leave this place. She must stay under my watch. I can't give her a chance to ruin Jingshen and Shu Yan's good time. Jinwan's breathing was already trembling. She abruptly opened her mouth. You're using such a method to force him. Have you considered the consequences you'll face tomorrow? Mo Xiaozhe laughed coldly. Consequences? Of course, the result will be you signing the divorce papers. Do you think that after tonight, Jingshen will still be yours? In both her lives, Jinwan had never been so angered that her entire body was trembling. If the person in front of her was not Mo Jingshen's father, she would definitely take a knife and chop him. Sensing her agitated emotions, Elder Mo pressed down on her hand. Brat, go back with grandfather first. She can't leave. Mo Xiao's eyes were filled with displeasure. She must leave with me. Elder Mo grabbed onto Jin Wan's wrist, unwilling to leave her here. She's Jing Shin's person. Even if Jing Shin isn't here on account that Jin Wan calls me grandfather, I'll bring her safely back to the Mo family. Xu Yan can also call you grandfather. Mo Xiao's expression was cold. After tonight, Jing Shin will know that the most suitable person for him is still in Xu Yan. Elder Mo's expression was cold. He still held onto Jin Wan's wrist tightly, blocking her behind him. Every time the two bodyguards tried to approach, the elder would raise his walking stick and force them away. Elder Mo angrily shouted, "Who dares to touch my granddaughter-in-law? Step over this old man's body first." Father. Mo Xiao's expression was dark. His voice was filled with warning and dissatisfaction. At your age, you shouldn't meddle in the matters of the younger generation. Elder Mo refused to move aside. Even though he was old, his gaze was still bright. It was not much different from his 50-year-old son. Mo Xiaoza watched this scene. After a moment, he furrowed his brows and impatiently waved his hand. All right. Let them go. Send the elder back to the Mo residence. Elder Mo's expression did not soften. He directly brought Jin Wan, whose face was pale from anger, down the stairs. It's fine to bring Jin Wan back to the Mo residence. Tomorrow morning I'll have Jing Shen and Xu Yan go back to see you and sign the divorce papers with her. Mo Xiaoza stood at the foot of the stairs, speaking heavily. Elder Mo coldly harumphed and did not pay him any heed. Finally Jin Wan was brought into the car. Elder Mo sat in the front, his expression heavy as he called for the chauffeur to drive. He then turned back to comfort her. Child, don't worry. I believe in Jing Shen. With his willpower he will definitely be able to overcome everything that happened tonight. He loves you and will protect your marriage. Other than you he won't touch any other woman. Trust grandfather. Jin Wan had suppressed her emotions for a long time. She tried her best to maintain her composure in front of the elders so that he would not worry too much. She softly asked, "So, is he really locked up within Xu Yan?" Elder Mo sighed softly. "I know very well what kind of person Jing Shin's father is. Today he ordered people to forcefully lock you up here. The matter on Jing Shin's side is most likely true. If I hadn't heard the news from Xiao Zhe's men, I wouldn't have been able to rush over to bring you away. Since you were able to find me, does that mean you know where Jing Shin is?" Jin Wan furrowed her brows. Elder Mo shook his head. "Before I rushed over, I had already sent people out to investigate. However, Haiqing is so big. There are tens of thousands of 4-star hotels and above. Right now the only thing grandfather can do is to rescue you. Right now I can't find Jing Shin, but you are Jing Shin's flesh and blood. I can't allow you to be harmed. Stop the car." Jin Wan suddenly said, "Grandfather, let me get off." Elder Mo was silent for a moment. It was not that he did not know her personality. After all, this was Jin Wan and Mo Jingshin's marriage. She had things she wanted to say and do. He should not stop her. The car had just stopped when Jin Wan abruptly pushed open the door and got off. She turned and ran back to the villa. Before the door closed, she rushed in. Mo Xiaoza heard the movements outside the door and turned back to look at Jin Wan, who had actually returned. His cold gaze was calm as he looked at her. "You've already been brought away by the elder. Why did you come back?" Mo Xiaoza coldly asked. Chapter 126. Mo Xiaoza smiled coldly. "You dare to threaten me? Your guts aren't small. Don't think that Jing Shin can protect you forever. Right now he's already together with Xu Yan. I advise you to hurry up and prepare for a divorce. Although human nature has a side that is hard to control, even if it's controlled by the drug." Jin Wan's gaze was firm. "But I still believe in him." After speaking without waiting for the two bodyguards to chase her out, Jin Wan directly turned and walked out. Returning to Grandfather Mo's car, she asked in a calm voice, "Grandfather, can you lend me your phone?" Elder Mo did not say much, directly passing the phone to her. Jin Wan picked it up and was about to call Mo Jingshin when she saw that there was an entire row of call records. There were more than 30 of Mo Jingshin's numbers. They were all numbers that Elder Mo had previously called him. There were so many of them, but not a single one was connected. Jin Wan calmly dialed Mo Jingshin's number and then placed the phone by her ear. After a short beep, there was a cold and emotionless female voice. "I'm sorry, the number you have dialed is temporarily unavailable." "Sorry? Mo home." On the way back it had already begun to rain. Right now the rain was pouring outside. Jin Wan sat on the bed. The pillow in her arms had already changed shape due to the strength she had used to hug it. The last time she stayed here was on Grandfather Mo's birthday. That night Mo Jingshin said, "Relax and be Mrs. Mo. You have me for everything." When she returned once again, sitting on this bed, all she could hear was the howling wind and heavy rain outside. She had called Mo Jingshin countless times, but none of them were able to connect. Elder Mo had sent out several batches of people, but they could not find any trace of him. Even the last location of Mo Jingshin's phone signal was checked, but there was no result. Time passed bit by bit. It was already 11 o'clock p.m. According to Mo Xiaoza, Mo Jingshin had been locked up within Shuyan since 7 o'clock p.m. An entire 4 hours had passed. There was a knock on the door. Jinwan sat on the bed and did not move. Finally, a helper pushed the door open. After taking a look, she turned and nodded at Elder Mo. Elder Mo's figure appeared by the door and walked in. "Brat, since you said you believe in Jing Shen, you should wait for him to come back in peace." Elder Mo looked at her, gently comforting her. "I watched Jing Shen grow up. I know very well what kind of person he is, how his character is, and how his self-control is." Jinwan nodded silently and did not speak. She knew how it felt to be drugged. After all, she had experienced it before. How she had suffered that night and how her body reacted naturally. Those scenes and feelings were magnified infinitely in her mind and body. It had been 4 hours. If it was her, if she was locked in the same room with a man for 4 hours that night, she would definitely have a mental breakdown. If she really couldn't control herself in the end, she might hit her head on the wall and would rather die. What about Mo Jingshin? What would happen to him now? It was said that the drug would completely destroy a man's rationality, and he would only be able to rely on his biological instincts. Rumble, the deafening thunder sounded again, and a bolt of lightning flashed across the dark night sky. The dazzling light illuminated the front yard of the Mo mansion, but it was instantly drowned in the endless darkness. Chapter 127. At this time, why would there be a car coming? Elder Mo's eyes were suddenly filled with hope. He turned back and urged, "Quickly go take a look. Has Jingshin returned?" The moment the elder spoke, Jinwan was already one step ahead of everyone else and ran out first. "Aya, Brat, why didn't you bring an umbrella? Quickly hold an umbrella for her. Don't get wet." Elder Mo chased after her with his walking stick, but he could not catch up to Jinwan's speed. He watched as Jinwan ignored the pouring rain and rushed out the door. The helper and butler rushed out with umbrellas. Jinwan did not notice how cold and wet she was. She only stared at the car lights and ran over. However, when she approached, she realized that the car was not Mo Jingshin's but a taxi. Her footsteps paused. She stood in the rain. The night lights on both sides of the Mo family's courtyard swayed slightly under the rain. The car door opened. The moment she saw Shuyan's figure standing by the car, Jinwan's brows instantly froze. Shuyan came over with an umbrella after alighting. She raised her eyes to see Jinwan, and her footsteps paused. She then turned to see the helper and butler come over to hold the umbrella over Jinwan's head. However, at this time Jinwan's entire body was already drenched. Shuyan approached Jinwan. Through the curtain of rain she softly said, "Mrs. Mo, I'm very sorry." Jinwan stood there watching Shuyan, who came alone. From start to finish she did not see Mo Jingshin's figure. Her expression was calm, but it was as though she was silently suppressing her emotions. Her gaze was cold and her tone was low and slow. "What did you do? Are you going to apologize to me?" Shuyan lowered her eyes, holding on to the umbrella. "The rain is so heavy. Let's go in and talk." "That's right, madam. Your hands are all wet. Quickly go back and change." The helper held the umbrella for Jinwan while reaching out to pull her back. Jinwan silently stared at Shuyan. She saw a flash of emotion in Shuyan's eyes and immediately seemed to understand something. She did not speak further and allowed the helpers to drag her back into the villa. The old man had just taken a few steps behind them with an umbrella. Seeing that they were about to enter, he hurriedly asked the servant to open both doors of the villa and let them in quickly. The helper deftly brought 2 thick blankets over to cover Jinwan. Shuyan had been holding the umbrella and was not drenched. She placed the umbrella down the moment she entered. "Shuyan? How could it be you? What's going on with you guys today?" Elder Mo saw that Shuyan was dressed neatly and was not locked in a room like Mo Xiaoza had said. "Grandpa Mo, I'm sorry. I should have come earlier, but because there were spies around I couldn't avoid them. That's why I came so late." Shuyan said to Elder Mo apologetically, "I can explain tonight's situation to you, But can I speak to Mrs. Mo alone for a few words first? Elder Mo furrowed his brows, turning to look at Jin Wan, whose head and face were drenched in rain. Jin Wan calmly looked at An Shuyen, her voice cold. What do you want to say? An Shuyen directly walked toward her, using her gaze to indicate for Jin Wan to go to the side to speak. Jin Wan did not speak, turning to walk to the first floor of the villa near the blue and white porcelain vase. An Shuyen stood by her side. When she spoke, her voice was so soft that only Jin Wan could hear. To be honest, to me, tonight is indeed a rare opportunity. I've liked Xiao Mo for many years. Ever since I was a teenager, my father and Uncle Mo promised me that they would definitely let me marry him. Because the autumn rain was too cold, Jin Wan's face and lips were pale from the cold. However, her gaze was cold and bright. So, for Missin to come here at this time, it shouldn't be as simple as expressing your stance. And Shuyen smiled mildly, but her smile was somewhat bitter. The reason I like Xiao Mo is because I really like him too much and I look up to this man too much. That's why I can't use such a method to forcefully keep him. Jin Wan silently raised her brows. Liking was possessive, while love was not easily profane. It was as though it was only at this moment that Jin Wan truly felt An Shuyen's seriousness toward Mo Jingshan. An Shuyen's tone was mild and unhurried. I've always known about today's plan. Although Uncle Mo's methods were a little overboard, I initially tacitly agreed and accepted it. However, at the most crucial moment I gave up. In order to avoid Uncle Mo's spies, I gave the cup of coffee that they gave me to another female secretary who was traveling with me. The coffee contained something similar to a knockout drug, something that would cause a person to faint for more than 10 hours. After she fainted, I exchanged clothes with her. The people Uncle Mo sent were not particularly familiar with me, so they directly brought the unconscious female secretary away and sent her to the designated room. Jin Wan glanced at her. Since you agreed to this plan from the start, why did you still drug yourself? And Shuyen chuckled lightly. It should be easy for you to figure out the reason. Jin Wan coldly smiled. Indeed. And Shuyen was a shrewd woman. If she wanted to use this opportunity to be together with Mo Jingshan, she would definitely leave a way out for herself. If she was also drugged, she could logically become the innocent party. Actually, if it was a fair competition, I might not lose to you. Even if I lose because of Xiao Mo's feelings for you and not because of you, Jin Wan, and Shuyen softly emphasized. Jin Wan indifferently curved her lips. Missin, from the moment you agreed to cooperate with this plan, you had already lost. And Shuyen's expression faltered. The trace of distress in her eyes did not escape Jin Wan's eyes. As long as you had the slightest chance of winning, you would never agree to such a lowly and despicable plan. The coldness in Jin Wan's eyes surged. In the end, what woke you up was not because of how much you love Mo Jingshan, but because you understand him too well. You knew that such an outcome would not only fail to obtain him, but it would also bring about unimaginable consequences. And Shuyen smiled. Mrs. Mo, you really aren't like the rumors. Perhaps I've really underestimated you. I don't need your overestimation. Jin Wan dragged out her words. Right now, it is Miss Anne's sobriety that has truly saved your life. You know very well that Mo Jingshan is not someone who can be easily manipulated or threatened by others. This step of yours is to protect yourself. And Shuyen suddenly stared at her, speaking in a low voice. Right now, your words are so rude. Aren't you afraid that I'll just walk away right now and continue hiding Xiao Mo's whereabouts? Chapter 128. Even though the rain on Jin Wan's head and body made her look extremely wretched, she was still so calm that An Shuyen could not help but want to see through her soul. She wanted to see how this Jin Wan, who usually did not show any sharpness, was different from others. However, her words had already been pointed out by Jin Wan. And Shuyen indeed had no way of rebutting her words. Tonight, if you haven't found your side and continue to stand by Director Mo's side, I'm not sure what the consequences will be, but I'm sure you won't be able to bear it. Jin Wan's tone was calm. Only by helping me can you save yourself and the Yin family from this disaster. Missin, you've already made up your mind before coming here. Now you want to use leaving to threaten me? And Shuyen's complexion was no longer as good as before. However, she forced a smile on her lips. At a time like this, you can still be so clear-headed. I really wonder if you even love Xiao Mo. The more uncertain the situation, the more clear-headed I should be, especially when facing you, Missin. If I still lose my composure, then I'm afraid I really am not worthy of the 3 words Mrs. Mo. Jin Wan's expression was calm, her tone mild. Elder Mo could not hear what they were talking about from the other side. Right now, he was so anxious that he directly walked over, wanting to ask what exactly was going on. Hearing the elder's movements, and Shuyan did not waste any more time. She softly said, "I don't know how long that female secretary will be unconscious for, but she has indeed been sent into that room. After all, it has already been over 4 hours. This kind of torture, I don't know how much longer COMO can endure." Jin Wan finally furrowed her brows and looked toward her. "He's in the Wan Li Xingchen Hotel on Bin Hai Road, 33rd floor, room 3320. However, the entire 33rd floor is guarded by Uncle Mo's people. It's impossible to directly enter that floor. I can only bring my words to this point. Think of a way yourself." With that, and Shuyan turned to face the approaching elder Imo. "Grandfather Imo, tonight's matter has startled you. I'm really sorry. Uncle Imo has always been a very domineering person. If he wants to do something, no one will easily stop him. You must know his temper very well." Afterward, and Shuyan pulled Elder Imo to the side to continue talking. Jinwan did not walk over. She only watched the lightning, thunder, and storm outside the window. Earlier, and Shuyan's words reminded Jinwan that although Elder Imo was powerful in High City, the majority of Shine Group and the Imo family's power was in Imo Xiao's hands. Even if he was not suppressed by Elder Imo in name, if Imo Xiaoza really feared the Elder's power, he would not have done such a thing tonight. If Grandfather Imo sent someone to the hotel right now, he might not be able to bring Imo Jingshan out in time. On the other hand, it was very likely that Grandfather Imo would cut off all ties with his biological son Imo Xiaoza. Furthermore, there might even be people who wanted to take advantage of the situation and cause internal strife in the Imo family. 15 minutes later, Jinwan returned to her room to dry her hair, changed her clothes and went out. Ignoring the Imo family's obstruction, she drove straight out of the Imo family's gate. Before she left, she only left one sentence for Grandfather Imo. "Grandfather, I'm going to bring Jingshan back. Wait for me." Bin Hai Road, Wanli Xingchen Hotel. This was a newly opened 7-star hotel in High City. It had only been opened for less than a month and had yet to be entered into High City's website. If one wanted to check, it would be easy to overlook the existence of this new hotel. Because it had just opened, the security inside and outside of the hotel were still under construction and could not be considered perfect. Also, because the hotel was too expensive and was located in this area of Bin Hai Road, there were not many people staying in the hotel. There were also not many staff in the hotel. Jinwan drove over and tossed the car keys to the security guard outside the door. She took her bag and walked into the main entrance of the hotel. The feeling she gave off did not seem like she had come with a motive. She was dignified, gentle, and calm, appearing like a guest who had no choice but to stay in this hotel for the night due to the heavy rain. Her appearance at this moment did not arouse the suspicion of the staff. After handing over her identification, Jinwan stood at the front desk and said, "This is a sea view hotel, right? Can you give me a room on a higher floor? This way the view from the balcony will be better. The price doesn't matter. It's best if it's above the 30th floor." "I'm sorry, miss. Tonight, the 31st to 35th floors have all been booked. Only the 30th floor and below can be checked in. Is room 3016 okay?" "It's on the 30th floor," the lady at the front desk asked politely. Jinwan smiled mildly and nodded. "Sure. All right. This is the room card for room 3016. Please keep it well." After receiving the room card, Jinwan quickly walked into the elevator. She did not look at anyone and quickly went upstairs to her room. After entering and closing the door, Jinwan flung her bag aside and rushed to the window. Ignoring the raging storm outside, she opened the floor-to-ceiling windows on the balcony and walked out. She raised her head to look in the direction of the 33rd floor. Earlier on, she had looked carefully on this floor. Room 3020 was only 2 doors away from her room 3016. Room 3320, where Mo Jingshan was now, was in the room on the right. Jinwan stared up and gripped the balcony railing tightly. She tested the firmness of the railing and then turned back to take out a pair of sneakers from her bag. She changed out of the high heels on her feet and put on the sneakers, tying the laces tightly. Finally, she threw her bag on the bed and only carried the room card with her. She turned back to the balcony and jumped up with force. She carefully stepped on the railing on the balcony and at the same time, shifted her gaze to the outdoor air conditioner half a meter above her. She tried to step on it. Very good. The outdoor air conditioner was installed very firmly. There was even a very sturdy square railing around it. Jinwan did not dare to look down. After all, the height of the 30th floor was something she had never dared to challenge in her 2 lives. She hardened her heart and gripped the railing on the outside of the air conditioner to step up. She then carefully stepped on the firewall and metal railing necessary for high-rise buildings. Step by step, the 31st floor, the 32nd floor, the 33rd floor. In room 3320, the shower head was turned off. Mo Jingshin, who had taken dozens of cold showers, put on his shirt and walked out of the bathroom. His dark, boundless eyes coldly glanced at the unconscious woman on the bed. A murderous aura spread around him. Mo Jingshin casually threw the blanket on the bed over the woman, covering her from head to toe. When he turned, he suddenly heard strange movements outside the window. Chapter 129. Then, a rain-drenched head popped out from the other side of the balcony. Mo Jingshin raised his brows and hurriedly walked over. With a schwa sound, he opened the floor-to-ceiling window. Outside the window, the wind and rain intertwined. At that moment, the curtains fluttered dreamily. Jin Wan's figure gradually became clear on the balcony. Finally, the woman gritted her teeth and jumped in from the railing. However, because of the rain, her legs were already cramping. The moment she jumped down, she fell to the ground. She hissed in pain and rubbed her cramping calf while inadvertently raising her eyes to look inside. At first glance, she saw Mo Jingshin in front of the window. Before she could clearly see the man's expression, Jin Wan subconsciously stood up with a whoosh. However, the pain in her legs made her fall forward the moment she stood up and took a step forward. This time, she simply threw herself into the man's arms. For the first time in his life, Mo Jingshin was so shocked that he didn't move for a long time. The weight in his arms brought him back to himself. He subconsciously held the little woman who threw herself into the cold rain and air. Jin Wan's face bumped hard against his chest and she gave a low, muffled moan. "You!" Outside the window, thunder rumbled. Mo Jingshin felt the coldness from Jin Wan's body. Without saying a word, he closed the window and then pushed the woman in his arms away from him. He lowered his eyes and stared at her as though he was looking at a monster. He looked at her from top to bottom and saw a bloody scratch on her face. "How did you come up?" he asked in a low voice, but his hand had already touched her cold face. His cold eyes showed no emotion. Instead, he was so angry that he seemed to want to throw her down from the 33rd floor. Jin Wan didn't explain. She was cold, but Mo Jingshin's body was too hot. She endured the terrible pain in her legs and clutched his shirt tightly. Feeling the heat from his body, she quickly looked around the room. Seeing the bulging quilt on the bed, she didn't hesitate to lift the quilt to see if the woman was wearing clothes. However, when she was about to move, her calf ached so much that she grimaced in pain and almost fell to the ground. If Mo Jingshin hadn't held her up, she would have fallen down. "It hurts. It hurts." Seeing that she was in so much pain that her expression was about to contort, Mo Jingshin's cold expression softened slightly. He looked at her leg. "Where does it hurt?" "Cramp, my left calf." Jin Wan's face was pale as she pointed at her own calf. "Be gentler, it hurts." Mo Jingshin touched the area on her calf that was cramping. His gaze darkened and he picked her up by the waist. He entered the bathroom, adjusted the water temperature, and carried Jin Wan to sit by the bathtub. He poured the warm water on her legs, warmed her legs with one hand, and used the other to rub the cramps on her calf. He rubbed it lightly and heavily. After about 2 minutes, Jin Wan's expression finally eased, and her legs were no longer stiff. She moved slightly in his arms. "Are you done?" he asked. His eyes were still cold, but his hands were still gentle as he massaged her. Jin Wan nodded hard and glanced out of the bathroom. From this angle she could not see the big bump under the blankets. She then saw Mo Jingshin's slightly messy but elegant shirt and trousers. After hesitating for 2 seconds, she reached out to touch his face. Mo Jingshin stiffened because of her movement. His gaze deepened and he pressed her hand down. "Don't move." He poured the hot water from the top of her head down, trying to warm her up as soon as possible. Jin Wan could see that he was not feeling well. Her eyes reddened and she threw herself into his arms without a care. When he was caught off guard and took 2 steps back, she hugged his neck tightly and did not let go. She whispered by his ear, "Was there a woman on the bed earlier?" Mo Jingshin raised his hand and stroked her wet long hair. He said hoarsely, "N." There was no time to explain what had happened. Jin Wan hugged him even tighter. "Did you touch her?" "No," he answered without hesitation. Although the man's voice was hoarse, it was much more sober than Jin Wan had imagined. The heavy stone in Jin Wan's heart was immediately lifted. She seemed to finally be able to relax. She leaned into his arms as though she had lost all her strength. She allowed the man to hold her and sit by the bathtub. She allowed him to pour the warm water on her body and warm her up bit by bit. I knew it. Jinwan could no longer hold back her emotions. She sobbed and hugged him. I knew it. I knew it. Mo Jingshan could hear that the little woman was crying. It seemed like she had finally relaxed but was still afraid. He put down the shower head and hugged her. The strong heat from his body was transmitted to hers. The cold and hot temperatures matched each other perfectly in this rainy night. The door to this room can't be opened. There are people guarding outside, aren't there? Jinwan asked, choking. And Mo Jingshan's voice was still hoarse. Jinwan sniffled and suddenly sat up from his arms. She looked at him with red eyes. Are you feeling terrible right now? How did you endure it for so many hours? It was clear that she knew everything. Mo Jingshan did not say more. He rubbed her head comfortingly and said calmly, I'm fine. You're still saying you're fine? Right now, your temperature is even higher than a normal person's when they have a fever. Jinwan put her hand on his chest and touched it. She heard the man groan softly because of her touch and his eyes darkened. She leaned over and kissed the corner of his lips. Although her eyes were a little red, they were bright. She said eagerly, then don't hold back now. I'm here. You can do whatever you want now. Mo Jingshan chuckled softly and kissed her lips. He said hoarsely, silly girl, this place is not suitable. Why is it not suitable? Weren't you drugged? You're definitely not allowed to touch women outside. Now that I'm here, what are you enduring? This is the first time I've taken the initiative. You're actually not giving me any face. Jinwan glared at him and reached out to undo his shirt. Mo Jingshan pressed her hand down. Earlier he could at least endure it. But now that Jinwan was suddenly here, and her entire body was wet as she pressed against him, not to mention being drugged, even if it was a normal day, he might not be able to endure her teasing. He pressed her into his embrace, saying hoarsely, not here. There are surveillance cameras. Jinwan's expression stiffened. She stared at him in disbelief and rushed to move away from his embrace. However, Mo Jingshan held her tightly and did not allow her to move. He warned hoarsely, be obedient. Don't move. Chapter 130. Then if I'm in your arms right now, won't you feel even more uncomfortable? Jinwan carefully maintained a distance from him. Even so, she could still feel the shocking heat from his body. What kind of terrifying self-control did Mo Jingshan have? Even in such a situation he could still endure it. With your current state, there's no difference to me whether you're standing there or sitting in my arms. Mo Jingshan held her waist, breathing in the light scent of rainwater on her body. Why don't you let me hold you for a while? Jinwan sat in his arms unmoving. However, as he was tormented, her heart did not feel good either. The man held her just like that, pressing his head against her snow-white neck. His burning kiss landed on her collarbone, causing her body to tremble. Feeling her sensitive reaction, Mo Jingshan tightened even more. He closed his eyes to avoid looking at her, choosing to chat to distract himself. He asked, how did you know I was here? And Shuyan went to the Mo family, Jinwan answered honestly. Jinwan answered truthfully. She said that although she wanted to be with you, she didn't want to do it in this way, so the person who was sent to your room tonight was not her, but another female secretary who was with her. Jinwan did not need to lie, nor did she need to defame Shuyan. After all, Shuyan's motive was something that even she could sense. It was impossible for Mo Jingshan not to know. As expected, after hearing these words, Mo Jingshan opened his eyes. His gaze turned colder and his grip on Jinwan tightened. He said softly, so earlier on you climbed up from below? Although he was softly asking by her ear, his voice carried a hint of danger. Jinwan made a sound, thinking of how to phrase her words so that he would not be angry. I was too anxious. I was afraid that you would lose your chastity, so I'm asking if you climbed up from below. Mo Jingshan's tone became colder. He lowered his eyes to stare into her eyes. Jinwan recalled the frightening experience earlier. When she reached the 32nd floor because the rain was too slippery, she almost fell down. She did not have any protective measures on her. The fact that she was able to climb up with her life was really a blessing from the heavens. I didn't climb very high. From the 30th floor, I only climbed 3 floors, she softly said without much confidence. 3rd floor? Mo Jingshan's gaze turned cold inch by inch. His tone carried obvious anger and reprimand. Do you know which floor this is? Firemen need ladders and ropes to climb a building and you just climbed up like that? Are you tired of living? But the area between the 31st floor and the 35th floor is locked down. I have no other choice. Besides, aren't I fine now? Jinwan reached out to tug on the sleeve of his shirt. She tugged on it gently and whispered, I'm lucky. I'll be fine. At this time, Mo Jingshan's eyes were frighteningly deep. He stared at the bruise on her face and suddenly shook her hand off. Jinwan paused and thought he was really angry. She rushed to stand up, but the man went out and turned the dim light in the bathroom into the brightest one. The moment the light came on, she narrowed her eyes and in an instant, he had returned to the bathroom. Without waiting for her to stand up, Mo Jingshan expressionlessly held her calf that was no longer cramping. He lifted it up and before Jinwan could cry out in alarm, he had already pulled up her pants. When he saw the red marks on her knees and legs caused by the sharp edges of the air conditioner, his gaze turned even colder. I'm really fine. These are just scratches on the surface of my skin. Mo Jingshan did not say a word as he pulled up her sleeves again. He saw the bruise on her wrist and the red marks on her elbows that were even more serious than those on her legs. He then turned her hands over and saw her swollen fingers and bruised palms. Jinwan's gaze faltered. She tried to retract her hand but was held tightly by the man. I'm really fine. I'm just... Jinwan wanted to speak but saw that Mo Jingshan's gaze was frighteningly heavy. She pursed her lips and suddenly smiled to say, Thankfully, the security in this hotel isn't that good. Otherwise, I would have been discovered the moment I climbed out. The distance between each floor isn't too far, and there are fixed air conditioners in the middle as stairs. In fact, it's really very safe. I'm not even afraid, so you don't have to. Before she could finish speaking, Mo Jingshan suddenly held the back of her head and pressed her heavily into his embrace. It was very, very heavy. For a moment, she could not speak. She felt as though she was being pressed into his body. The man did not say a word and only held her. Jinwan gradually calmed down. She no longer tried to explain or make a sound. She quietly allowed him to hold her, pressed her face against his burning neck and closed her eyes. It had been a thrilling night. No matter what, at least they did not lose each other. That was enough. Earlier, when she climbed up from the 30th floor, she did not think about anything else. Her only thought was to quickly find him and see him. Even if her body was smashed into pieces, she would not give up the slightest chance to help him. Even though she had already calmed down, she did not regret it. In his embrace, Jinwan closed her eyes. Her hand climbed up to his well-defined back and hugged his back. However, due to the heat from his body, she opened her eyes and asked softly in his embrace, Do you want to soak in cold water? Mo Jingshan hugged her and did not let go. He gently kissed the top of her head. With you here, it's useless even if you put me in an ice cellar. Then what should we do? Why don't we turn off the lights? The surveillance cameras shouldn't be able to capture anything. Mo Jingshan did not speak. Could it be that the surveillance cameras have night vision? Jinwan suddenly raised her head to look at him. He looked at her, silently agreeing. Mo Xiaoza was too ruthless. Although he would not go so far as to specially watch the surveillance footage of his son sleeping with a woman, the reason he installed a camera in the room was most likely to use the surveillance footage as evidence if Mo Jingshan rejected him in the future. Thus, night vision cameras were definitely used. Then what should we do? Jinwan felt that he was even hotter than before. Mo Jingshan's brows moved. He lowered his eyes to look at her and suddenly smiled. Right now, his shirt was slightly disheveled, and his gaze was unusually dark. There was a sense of decadence and attractiveness to him. It's all right. The sky is about to brighten. This type of drug will usually wear off after 12 hours. It's only 1 in the morning. Jinwan lowered her head and suddenly raised her hand. Why don't I use my hand to help you? Chapter 131. The man's voice was hoarse and seductive. Jinwan could barely stand it. Furthermore, right now, he was in such extreme torment, Jinwan thought he was embarrassed. She had already thrown caution to the wind. What was there to be embarrassed about? She reached out to tug on the belt hidden under his shirt. Mo Jingshan abruptly pressed down on her hand. His gaze was heavy and filled with indescribable darkness and profoundness as he stared at this little woman who did not know life from death. The surveillance cameras have blind spots. Let's find a corner where the cameras can't capture us. Jinwan did not wish to see him suffer so silently. She took the initiative to look back at the bathroom and several places around the bathtub. Here. After the lights are turned off, there's also the door. It definitely won't capture us. As she spoke, she took a step back toward the bathroom door. Her hand was still tightly gripping the corner of his shirt, preventing him from moving away. The moment Jinwan hid behind the door, Mo Jingshan sighed softly. He did not allow her to undo his belt but instead held her wrist, leaning down to kiss her harshly on the lips. The kiss was deep and heavy as though he wanted to skin her alive. In the end, he forcefully pressed down Jinwan's disobedient hand that was moving back and forth on his body. He gave a low, muffled snort, speaking through gritted teeth. "Do you want me to die?" Jinwan's hand was restrained by him and could not move. She could only stare at him helplessly and say with incomparable sincerity, "It's just using my hand. I really know how to do it. In the past, Xia Tian and I secretly watched that kind of movie." Seeing Mo Jingshan's raised brows, Jinwan immediately revealed an excited expression. "It's rare for me to have such an active opportunity. Don't you cherish it?" "Of course I have to cherish it." Mo Jingshan chuckled softly but still held her wrist. "Although the wound on your palm is not deep, it was scratched by those metal edges when you climbed up. This kind of injury requires a tetanus shot. Now that you've been soaked in the rain, it's already red and swollen." As he spoke, he comforted her, gently kissing her forehead. "I can't take the risk of letting your wound get infected. It'll be over after one night. It's all right." At this moment, Jinwan deeply regretted that she had prepared everything else but forgot to prepare a pair of anti-abrasion and scratch-resistant rubber gloves when climbing up. She looked at her red and swollen palms for a while, and from time to time, some blood would flow out from the thin wounds. She sat there with furrowed brows. Mo Jingshan thought she was thinking about the wound on her palm, but in the next moment, Jinwan's words almost caused the composure he had maintained for more than 20 years to collapse. "How about I try it with my mouth?" Seeing that the man suddenly fell silent, Jinwan actually felt a little embarrassed. After all, she had seen a lot of big movies in the next 10 years. Although she had never done it before, she was not too unfamiliar with it. "Then I'll go turn off the bathroom lights." Jinwan stood up and was about to walk around the man in front of her to turn off the lights outside the bathroom. However, the moment she got up, her wrist suddenly tightened. The man pressed her against the wall and buried his burning face in her neck. He hugged her tightly and said in an unbelievably hoarse voice, "If you really want to try, I'll give you the chance anytime after we leave this place." Jinwan's face instantly flushed red. "Who said I wanted to try? I just saw that you were in too much pain." Mo Jingshan chuckled hoarsely, hugging her. "There's no need. Just hold me like this. Stand here and don't move." "Are you sure that just a hug is enough?" And his voice was still low and hoarse. "But I feel like you're in a lot of pain." He did not speak again, hugging her tightly. Jinwan leaned against the wall, allowing the man's tense body to press against hers. There was no gap between their bodies, and his body temperature gradually warmed her up. Jinwan obediently raised her hands to hug his back, pressing her face against his chest. She closed her eyes and listened to the man's heart that was not as steady and calm as usual. But even so, even though Mo Jingshan's short black hair was slightly messy, he was still incomparably handsome. Even though his shirt and pants were half soaked by her, he still possessed his unique charm of calmness and self-control. In comparison, Jinwan, who had climbed up from the 30th floor with no regard for her life, was completely soaked. There were still some traces of blood on her clothes, and there were small red marks on her face. She looked unbelievably wretched. She did not expect that even at this stage she was still more wretched than him. They hugged for a long time, so long that Jinwan felt as though she was about to be burned by the heat of his embrace. She had only just begun to relax for the night when she leaned against his chest and almost fell asleep. All of a sudden, the man said in a low and hoarse voice, "Go out first. Let me take a shower." Jinwan opened her eyes. She was about to fall asleep, but she did not immediately wake up. She asked in a daze, "Is it cold water?" Jinwan nodded and cooperatively turned to walk out of the bathroom. In the end, a dry towel was suddenly tossed over her head. "It's not convenient to take off your clothes here. Your body is still wet. Wrap the towel around yourself." Jinwan nodded again, hugging the towel as she walked out. The consequence of relaxing was that she really wanted to sleep. She wrapped the towel around her body and subconsciously wanted to lie down on the bed or the sofa for a while. However, as soon as she got close to the bed, she saw the big bulge under the blanket, and the sleepiness in her head instantly disappeared. She composed herself and turned on the dim wall lamp at the head of the bed. She slowly reached out and lifted the quilt. Sure enough, she saw a young woman lying there quietly. Her breathing was steady, and she had been sleeping so peacefully in this situation. As expected, she had been drugged. Although he didn't know how long the woman on the bed was going to sleep for, her clothes were still intact, and there was nothing that shouldn't be exposed. The quilt was probably thrown over by Mo Jingshan, and even her face was not exposed. After all, she was a secretary of the Mo Corporation. If she had not had coffee with Shuyan, she would not have been sent to the big boss for no reason. After all, she was an innocent person. Jin Wan gently covered her with the quilt again. Although her face was covered, she still left a gap at the edge of the quilt to prevent her from suffocating. Outside the window, the rain was still falling, but it was lighter than before, and the thunder was farther away. Jin Wan stood by the window looking at the sea not far away. Even now, she did not dare to look down from this angle. From the height of the 33rd floor, she could not even see the flower beds downstairs clearly. The passing cars were all fingernail-sized shadows. The word, love, was indeed a superstition of the right time and the right place. It would inexplicably give people fearless courage and even disregard life and death. Chapter 132. The few hours before daybreak were similarly torturous for Jin Wan. The two of them slept on the sofa. Mo Jingshan held Jin Wan in his arms. Jin Wan slept soundly in his arms, but she could vaguely feel that his body was unusually hot. It was not until 4 or 5 in the morning when the sky gradually brightened. Jin Wan slept and opened her eyes to look at the dark room. At the same time, she felt that Mo Jingshan had finally fallen asleep. Although his body temperature was slightly hotter than usual, it was not as severe as last night. He must have endured the most difficult part and finally fell asleep from exhaustion. Jin Wan did not move as she leaned against his chest. She listened to his heartbeat and slowly raised her hands to hug his neck, closing her eyes. She did not know if the sleeping man had woken up or if it was out of instinct, but he hugged Jin Wan tighter. A gentle kiss landed on the top of her head. It appeared to be an unintentional kiss, but it caused Jin Wan to uncontrollably smile in his arms. Jin Wan slept for another 2 hours. When she opened her eyes, the sky had already brightened. She raised her head and saw that Mo Jingshan had finally fallen into a deeper sleep. His body temperature had also completely dropped. She released a sigh of relief and moved gently and slowly out of his embrace. She then picked up his coat and covered his body. She tiptoed to the bedside and pulled open the curtains. She looked at the color of the sky. Although there was a thunderstorm last night, the sun was shining brightly this morning. It seemed like it was already past 7 in the morning. At this moment, footsteps approached from outside the door. Jin Wan vigilantly turned around. When she clearly heard that it was Elder Mo's voice, she directly walked to the door. "You sure hid Jingshan well? No wonder the people I sent out couldn't find the right place." Elder Mo angrily scolded as he walked by the door. "Brat, you can now be considered a schemer." Mo Xiao's voice rang from outside the door. "In front of father, I'm afraid I can't bear these words." Elder Mo coldly snorted. "What you can't calculate is the human heart. Just this time you still lost in the end. You sure are confident in Jingshan's self-control. Since you insisted on coming here so early in the morning, I won't keep you in suspense. After this door is opened, you'd better face reality and let Shu Yan marry over. That way I won't have to worry about this." Mo Xiao's tone was filled with certainty. Elder Mo chuckled. "Then go ahead and try opening the door." Jin Wan leaned against the door and listened to the conversation outside. When she heard the brief sound of a room card being swiped, her brows furrowed and she reached out to open the door from the inside. Mo Xiao's face originally had a hint of a cold smile. That kind of expression really matched Elder Mo's words. It had the flavor of a scheming and far-sighted person. However, the moment Jin Wan's figure abruptly appeared in the room, Mo Xiao's expression instantly stiffened. He quickly turned cold as he stared at her coldly. "Why are you here?" Jin Wan smiled at him coldly. "Good morning, Chairman Mo Xiaoza glared at her with an ugly expression. He abruptly wanted to enter the door to check on the situation inside, but Jin Wan stood in front of the door and did not move aside. A man in his 50s who was also Mo Jingshan's father, would not push her away. Elder Mo walked over with his walking stick, secretly giving Jin Wan a thumbs up. His eyes were filled with gratification and praise. He then calmly smiled at Mo Xiaoza, whose expression was extremely ugly. "How is it? If I say you've lost, then you've lost. Your old man is still your old man after all. When it comes to the matter of my granddaughter-in-law, you can't waver. How did you find it?" After all, Mo Xiaoza was someone who had seen wind and rain. After a moment, his expression darkened, and he coldly questioned Jin Wan. Jin Wan smiled mildly. It doesn't matter how you found me. What's important is that I was with Jingshin last night. Mo Xiaoza narrowed his eyes. Without waiting for him to speak, Elder Mo chimed in from the side. Brat, you've already married in for so long. Why are you still calling him Chairman Mo? Grandfather is here to support you. He's Jingshin's father. It's time for you to change the way you address him. Mo Xiaoza's expression was still very dark. The scene he expected to see did not happen. Instead, he was beaten up by Elder Jinwan this early in the morning. His face had been completely thrown away, and his gaze was dark and filled with anger. Jinwan hesitated for a moment, but she still had to give Grandfather Mo some face. She smiled slightly. That. Mo Xiaoza coldly watched her. I'm afraid I can't accept Miss Ji calling me Dad. If you want to call me that, then call me that. After all, you won't be able to call me that for long. Jinwan smiled nonchalantly. She did not lose her composure because of the coldness and threat in his words. She continued to stand in front of the door, refusing to let him in. Putting aside the fact that the unconscious woman inside was innocent and could not be implicated or seen by him, Mo Jingshin had stayed up all night and finally fell asleep at daybreak. He should at least be allowed to sleep a little longer. Elder Mo glared at Mo Xiaoza with a displeased expression. Brat has already given you enough face by calling you that. Can't you keep your stubborn temper in check? Jingshin's marriage is his own choice. Even if you're his father, you have no right to criticize him. This Brat has long belonged to the Mo family. Besides, she's still a 20-year-old child. Can't you speak nicely to her? Do you have to be so unreasonable? Elder Mo continued, as the saying goes, it's better to tear down a temple than to ruin a marriage. You're not young anymore. After staying in America for so long, have you forgotten how to write the word respect? How can you be so overbearing? Jingshin's future belongs to America and Shine, Mo Xiaoza coldly said. I don't wish to repeat myself. Xu Yan is the most suitable candidate. How isn't Xu Yan suitable? In terms of family background, Jinwan is not much worse off than Xu Yan. It's just that the Ji family is in Haicheng. In the future, if Jingshin returns to America to take over Shine, Jinwan's position by his side might not necessarily be worse than in Xu Yan's. You haven't even compared them and you're already denying Jinwan. You're really a stubborn old man. Being scolded by his 80-year-old father as a stubborn old man, Mo Xiaoza's expression darkened. He then coldly stared at Jinwan. Mo Xiaoza suddenly ordered the bodyguard behind him, pull her away. The bodyguard immediately rushed forward. Elder Mo saw this and fiercely slammed his walking stick against the ground, angrily saying, Who dares to touch my granddaughter-in-law? Mo Xiaoza coldly stared at the elder, coldly ordering, Are you all deaf? Pull this woman away. Enough. Suddenly, a clear voice rang from behind Jinwan. Chapter 133. Mo Jingshin stood there expressionlessly. His clear voice carried a biting chill. His gaze was cold and heavy as he indifferently glanced over. The two bodyguards who were about to reach out to pull Jinwan broke out in cold sweat under Mo Jingshin's intense gaze. They did not dare to touch her again. Regardless of whether it was the room or the entire 33rd floor of the hotel, it was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. This was not the first time Jinwan had seen Mo Jingshin so cold, but his bone-chilling gaze still caused her to feel a chill down her spine. Mo Jingshin's gaze coldly swept past them. Who dares to touch her? Zio Mo, we were just following Director Mo's orders. He was worried about your condition in the room, so he asked us to. The two bodyguards explained with trembling expressions. Mo Jingshin's gaze was sharp and cold. His gaze landed on one of them and his lips curved into a mocking smile. Following orders? Jinwan stood by the door, silently standing there. From the start, she knew that Mo Xiaoza was completely unable to control Mo Jingshin. Otherwise, he would not have used such forceful methods. Sima Xiao's actions last night pushed Mo Jingshin further and further away. She could feel it from Mo Jingshin's current attitude. In his eyes, there was no longer this so-called father. Cold and chilling. Mo Jingshin approached Jinwan's side. He lowered his gaze to look at her small face that did not have the slightest hint of fear, and held her hand. Seeing Mo Jingshin's actions as he approached the door, Mo Xiaoza's expression instantly turned cold. His eyes were filled with displeasure. Jinwan thought that Mo Jingshin was using this method to appease her. She gently moved the hand he was holding, her fingers scraping against his palm in an attempt to ease the overly tense atmosphere. However, in the next moment she was suddenly pulled over by a force. Her entire body fell into Mo Jingshin's embrace, and she lost her footing. Mo Jingshan's strong arms held her like this, as though announcing his ownership of her. He calmly pressed her against his chest. Mo Jingshan's cold and firm voice brushed past her head. Jinwan is my wife. With me around, no one can shake her identity as Mrs. Mo. Mo Xiao's gaze was cold. Where is Xu Yan? She wasn't with you last night? At this moment, a gentle voice came from the elevator not far away. Uncle Mo, I'm very sorry. Mo Xiaoza suddenly turned around and looked at Xu Yan. The answer was self-evident. Mo Xiaoza's gaze was dark and ruthless. His sharp eyes narrowed. It seems like Xu Yan doesn't wish to use such a method to force others against their will. I can understand her hesitation. She's such a good woman who always thinks for you. Even at this stage she would still give up on this opportunity. It can be seen how deep her feelings for you are. Jingshan, you better watch carefully. I saw it very clearly. Mo Jingshan's tone carried a hint of mockery. I won't divorce her and I won't marry Xu Yan. I'll only marry one Jinwan in my life. That's enough. And Xu Yan stood in the distance and did not approach. Although Mo Jingshan's voice was cold and light, and the pitch was not high, it was enough for her to hear it clearly from this distance. She lowered her eyes and did not speak again. A trace of bitterness flashed past the corner of her eyes. Last night, during the lightning and thunder, when Jinwan drove out of the Mo family home alone, she should have known, from Jinwan's unwavering trust in Mo Jingshan's gaze, she should have known. Mo Xiao's expression was heavy, cold, and sullen. He then turned to look at Xu Yan's dispirited and quiet appearance and narrowed his eyes sharply and coldly. And Xu Yan politely nodded at him and turned to leave. She did not wish to stand here and listen any further. Mo Xiaoza abruptly turned to look at Jinwan, his eyes cold. Jingshan, so what if you care about this Jinwan? Women are just accessories to your career. If not for the Mo family's power, how could Jinwan, who was said to have her eyes on the top of her head, be willing to get married at the age of 20? Before the two of you got married, I'm afraid she didn't even know what kind of person you were. As for now, I'm afraid she still doesn't know. T. Elder Mo suddenly scolded from the side. Women are accessories to your career? If you have the ability, say the same thing to Jingshan's mother when you return to America. Mo Xiaoza furrowed his brows, coldly glancing at the elder. It was clear that he was unhappy that he was everywhere. What are you glaring at? Decades ago, if it weren't for your old man's sharp eyes that allowed you to carry the beauty home, would you have been able to marry Jingshan's mother? Back then she was also a young lady with her eyes on the top of her head. From the start, she did not even have any interest in a bad-tempered brat like you. In the end, didn't the two of you live happily ever after? You even gave birth to such a good grandson like Jingshan. Mo Xiaoza's chest was trembling with anger. Right now, he could not be bothered to argue with the elder. He only coldly glanced at Jinwan. Why aren't you answering? Do you understand Jingshan's past? Do you know what kind of person he is? Mo Jingshan's expression was very indifferent as he pulled Jinwan behind him. Jinwan suddenly chuckled lightly and walked out from behind him. She raised her eyes to look at Mo Xiaoza. Does Jingshan's mother know how old you were when you were weaned? Does she know how old you were when you stopped wetting the bed? Does she know how many teeth you lost when you were 7? Does she know how you held hands and kissed a certain young lady the first time you fell in love with her? Does she know what kind of person you were before you got married? Mo Xiaoza's expression was dark and cold. He immediately glared at her angrily. She definitely doesn't know. Jinwan maintained a smile on her face, but her lips were cold. Her eyes were clear and bright. She did not avoid his gaze in the slightest as she met his cold and ruthless gaze. Since she doesn't even understand your past, I think you can get a divorce at your age. Right now, it's very popular for old to marry the outstanding in Xu Yan. Isn't that what you want? You're impudent. Mo Xiaoza abruptly scolded harshly. You're still young but your temper is so fierce. Is this how your Ji family teaches you to be disrespectful to your elders? As your daughter-in-law, I can't even call you dad. This is already a great disrespect to you. Are you lacking a few more words of disrespect? Jinwan retorted. That's right. Elder Mo almost wanted to stand by Jinwan's side and give her a round of applause. Mo Xiaoza angrily closed his eyes. He pointed at Jinwan and then looked at the smiling elder. This is the granddaughter-in-law you chose? Elder Mo nodded repeatedly, his face full of smiles. That's right, the granddaughter-in-law I chose. Mo Xiaoza, dash. Chapter 134. Very good. Mo Xiaoza was enraged. I want to see just what abilities this Jinwan has to make everyone in the Mo family favor her so much. She doesn't need any abilities. As long as she's Jinwan, that's enough, Mo Jingshan calmly replied. Elder Mo chimed in. Just as well, this old man also wants to see what abilities Shuyan has, to be able to force you to use such methods against your own son. Elder Mo glared at Mo Xiaoza, whose expression had darkened. Everyone has their own preferences. You like Shuyan's radish, yet you insist on forcing her into Jingshan's vegetable pit. Everyone is an individual with their own preferences. As long as Jingshan likes it, as long as the two of them live peacefully, you shouldn't let anyone interfere between them. To think that you're Jingshan's father. Mo Xiaoza coldly smiled. For someone like Jinwan who doesn't respect her elders, don't expect me to accept her in this lifetime. If you can treat her like a daughter-in-law, Jinwan will naturally show respect to her elders. Mo Jingshan's voice did not have any warmth. This is the most basic form of balance and respect between people. Elder Mo nodded. That's right. Humans are mutual. To nitpick unilaterally, this isn't the attitude of an elder. It's unreasonable. Mo Xiaoza's expression darkened. He fiercely glared at the two bodyguards standing by the door who did not dare to move. He wanted to scold them for being useless. They did not even know when Jinwan entered the room last night. However, he was so angry that he did not want to speak anymore. With a dark expression, he turned and left. Mo Xiaoza directly flung his sleeves and left. No one stopped him. The floor returned to silence. Elder Mo looked toward Mo Jingshan, his tone kind. Jingshan, were you all right last night? I was fine. I've made you worry. Mo Jingshan smiled mildly. The elder nodded. Your father's temper has always been like this since he was young. Since last night's matter did not succeed, I'm afraid that old face of his won't be able to hold on for more than a few days. As long as there are no misunderstandings between you and this G-brat, it'll be fine. Grandpa, don't worry. I'm sober. Jinwan winked at the old man. Yo, now you're happy. Yesterday you locked yourself in Jingshan's room, hugging a pillow and curling up on the bed, and now you're gone? The elder laughed at her. Jinwan's face heated up. Grandfather, you're actually teasing me? Elder Mo laughed heartily. I won't laugh. Ah. The elder smiled and looked at Mo Jingshan with a red face. Jingshan, you'd better keep a close eye on this wife of yours. You're not allowed to lose her. If you dare to let her down, this old man will break your legs. Jinwan saw the old man raise his cane and instinctively moved closer to Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan chuckled, pulling the little woman who had subconsciously blocked his way behind him. His clear voice was like a flowing stream. I know. Elder Mo finally harumphed in satisfaction. His gaze shifted to Jinwan. How on earth did you sneak in last night? Jinwan winked at the elder and smiled. It's a secret. Little thing, you're still keeping your grandfather in suspense. All right, you probably didn't sleep well last night. Hurry back and rest. As for Jingshan's father, I have to think of a way to calm him down. As Elder Mo spoke, he walked out step by step with the support of his cane. As he walked, he muttered, Xiao Zhe has been in America for so many years. Standing on top of power, he's used to ordering his subordinates around. Everything has to be done according to his arrangements. His desire to control is too strong. I think he's tired of sitting in this position. Jinwan returned to the room on the 30th floor and took out the bag she had left here last night. She then called someone to secretly send the innocent female secretary back. She put down her phone and raised her eyes to see Mo Jingshan standing by the window of her room. The floor-to-ceiling windows were not open. He stood there, his gaze peering out at the balcony. Jinwan walked over and gently reached out to hug his waist from behind. She pressed her face against his back and breathed in the scent of his body that was like morning dew. She felt that his body temperature had returned to normal and rubbed her face against his back with a smile. I don't want to come to this hotel ever again. You didn't sleep well last night. Let's change places. You need to rest, she said against his back. The hands that had reached out to his chest were held by him. Mo Jingshan's gaze was still fixed on the balcony outside. From the 30th floor, he overlooked the boundless sea. Outside the window, the autumn wind blew past, causing the trees below to sway. He did not speak, only pressing her hands against his body and holding them gently. It was very gentle and warm. The room was quiet for a long time. Jinwan decided to act spoiled as she circled around to his front. She pressed against his chest and raised her head. I know it was my fault for taking such a risk last night. I promise next time I'll definitely... There won't be a next time, Mo Jingshan finally spoke. However, he lowered his eyes, and the seriousness in his gaze entered her eyes. All right, there won't be a next time. Jinwan raised her hand and made an expression as though she was swearing to the heavens. I'll never climb such a high building again. I promise. Mo Jingshan continued to look at her coldly. Jinwan tugged on his collar to lower his head. She kissed his chin twice and continued acting spoiled as she said, I promise. Don't be angry. If I had waited at home last night, I'm afraid I would have stayed up until my hair turned white. It's also good like this. Mo Jingshan's hand pinched her face. He touched the faint red mark on her face from last night. His warm fingers gently caressed it. His brows were deep and calm as he stared at her, as though he was looking into the depths of her soul. Jinwan's mind was shaken by his gaze. However, she remembered that this hotel was not suitable for them to stay for long and was about to move away from his embrace. However, the man's arms suddenly tightened around her. He stared into her eyes and kissed her. You don't, dirty? Jinwan rushed to move her face away. I haven't showered properly since yesterday. When I woke up, I didn't wash my face or brush my teeth. I'm definitely dirty. Don't kiss me. However, before she could finish her words, her face was abruptly turned back by him. The man's hand supported her face, preventing her from moving away. When he kissed her again, he pushed her teeth apart and kissed her deeply. There was no room for her to dodge at all. She opened her eyes to look at him. In the next instant, the man pressed her against the wall by the window. Because Jinwan did not brush her teeth in the morning, she did not even dare to open her mouth. Her entire body was stiff and unwilling to cooperate. However, his hands were like vines that wrapped tighter and tighter around her. It was as though he wanted to press her into his body and become one with her. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.